Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Savior King, the Master Tactician and the Queen of Liberation in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 1. If someone had told Dmitri just after he met Claude von Reagan for the first time that he would knock a man's teeth out for insulting him, he would have given them a strange look. It wasn't that he disliked the other man, he just found him incredibly exasperating. Claude was capable, intelligent, and charismatic, all traits worth admiring. However, he went out of his way to tease and bedevil people, rarely acting like the Duke he would become in a few years at best. That in and of itself wouldn't be too off-putting. Dmitri was friends with Sylvain, after all, if it weren't for the way he smiled. For all that Claude joked, teased, and generally acted casual, his eyes were always cold. When he smiled, bright and friendly, those green orbs were remote and unreadable. Dmitri wasn't a man easily unnerved after what the things he'd experienced, but it did unnerve him, that Claude could act so warm without feeling a thing. It was a carefully practiced act, had to be, seeing how many people fell for it and believed he was nothing but a troublemaker. If seeing the life leave people's eyes hadn't taught Dmitri to look more closely at them, he might have been fooled as well. People, even Edelgard, brilliant and people-savvy as she was, dismissed the young Duke for the person he pretended to be. Dmitri, meanwhile, feared that Claude was a good deal more dangerous than he appeared. If he could smile so warmly while being so cold inside, how could he trust anything the other man said? If he could feign friendship easily, without it meaning anything, didn't that mean he could discard his friends without a care the moment it was expedient? So perhaps Dmitri had been more aloof toward his fellow house leader than he should have been. Part of the reason he was at the academy was to foster good relations with his fellow future rulers. After all, he was hardly achieving that by being overly critical of the other man in the name of hiding his unease. Fate, however, as it so often did, was playing a trick on him. Dmitri wasn't sure what else to call a random happenstance that exposed him to Claude's best-kept secret. Dmitri had been headed to the training grounds when he heard the shouting. Someone was in a hideous temper, screaming abuse at another, and that never heralded anything good. Alarmed, he turned, and hurried back the way he came and into one of the monastery's many alleys, where a disturbing scene lay out before him. Cyril, a young man he'd seen a few times before in the Archbishop's company, was sprawled out a few feet away from a reedy man in church armor, a number of weapons scattered across the ground around him. Claude was standing a few feet back, a resigned look on his face. "Could have killed me, you little brat." The soldier was spitting, hands clenched into fists. "Hardly," Claude countered, taking a step forward and helping Cyril to his feet. The poor boy looked incredibly rattled. He didn't quite cower behind the older student, but he visibly backed away from the soldier, shoulders hunched. He doesn't have the strength to do that by accident. Besides, you're in full plate armor. At worst you would have had to knock out a dent. "Did I ask you, you Almiran mutt?" The soldier spat. Claude's demeanor changed instantly, greater than anything Dmitri had seen before. He went completely rigid, one hand sliding down to his belt and shifting back into a defensive stance. Those cold green eyes momentarily flared with alarm, and what almost looked like panic. "Geez," he complained, his voice amazingly calm, "get a bit of a tan and everyone assumes you're from the outside world. It really doesn't take much, does it?" Somehow the prince didn't think he was talking about his skin color. "Don't be coy, it's degrading." The soldier sneered, puffing himself up so he seemed taller. "Even if I couldn't smell it on you, I've fought at Fodlan's throat. I could recognize your kind a mile away." How humiliating for the Duke, for his only heir to be base-born half-breed. Cyril twisted and stared up at Claude, who seemed unmoved. "You know, considering you're a man of proper breeding," he said flippantly, "it's odd I'm not the one screaming bloody murder at a kid for bumping into me around a blind corner." "You have no right." The soldier took a menacing step forward. "Neither of you. You have no right to disgrace the monastery with your presence." "Enough." It took Dmitri a moment, when all three spun around to face him, to realize he in fact had spoken. He'd rather felt like he was in a dream, or maybe a memory. How many times had he needed to confront a soldier speaking to Didu in this very manner? How often, since the man had entered his house, had he needed to sternly order his servants to stop whispering behind his back, chew out soldiers for accidentally causing an injury during training. It didn't matter that he'd never set foot in Almira, he couldn't let this pass by without speaking up. "You forget yourself," he told the soldier, intentionally switching to the tones he used when speaking to his people. Even though he'd only done so a handful of times, Rodrigue had praised his oratory power. The Archbishop invited Cyril and Claude von Regan into these halls. "No one has more authority under the goddess than her. It is you who has no right, not to harass them, and certainly not to abuse Cyril over an honest mistake, the likes of which happens every day in this busy area." The Regan bastard prays to foreign gods. The soldier burst out, disbelief and anger warring in his voice. "He's spat on her kindness. It's in his blood. No good will come from having him here. He is a man." Dmitri cut him off ruthlessly, pitching his voice so it drowned out whatever bile was meant to follow. "Claude is a man no different from you, and he is no bastard, not under law, and I doubt he is one in spirit either. His mother returned with him to her place of birth, and that I believe speaks for itself. You owe him an apology, and Cyril too, and I suggest you start to consider what you will say to the Archbishop after I speak of this incident with her." "Dmitri," Claude's voice trailed off. Dmitri looked over the man's shoulder to see the archer staring wide-eyed at him. His expression, while still largely unreadable, seemed stunned. "Applauses. To the son of a whore. You would have . The sensation of his temper snapping was a palpable thing, Dmitri felt rather than saw his fist slam into the man's jaw. The force of the impact sent several teeth flying through the air, the man himself flew several feet back into the wall and dropped like a stone to the ground, out like a light. For a moment Dmitri worried that he might have killed him. Fortunately, movement in the soldier's chest put that to rest. Dmitri stared at the result of his work for a moment, then sighed, wiping the splatter of blood off his face. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, slightly embarrassed. "Hit him, that is. Hopefully this won't buy him more sympathy than he deserves." He stepped around his fallen victim and began gathering up the weapons that had caused the conflict. "Did he hurt you at all, Cyril?" And no, he didn't. Claude was there," the young man stammered out, scrambling to help. Come on, you don't have to . Please, it's the least I can do." Dmitri picked up the lance and carefully balanced it in Cyril's arms. "I'm so sorry you had to deal with that. Has that happened often?" Cyril opened his mouth, hesitated, then stammered out a weak-sounding denial. "Please, be honest. And not just with me, but Lady Rhea as well. She won't stand for this, I assure you." "She wouldn't, Claude murmured, just barely audible to them. Dmitri stood up and held out the few weapons to his counterpart. "Would you take these?" he asked politely. "I have to see to him. And speak with Seath. The fact that he felt comfortable attacking you and Cyril," he shook his head. Claude took the weapons without saying a word, green eyes sharpening. Dmitri was struck with the intense sense that he was being analyzed, though those emerald pools were as frustratingly enigmatic as ever. For him to slip so easily back into that calm, how often had he heard people say such things about him? "Yeah, no problem," the brunette said casually. "Though I'm not sure how you're going to explain that," he nodded toward the unconscious soldier. "Oh, I intend to tell the truth," Dmitri said firmly, striding over to the man and slinging him over one shoulder. The plate armor dug uncomfortably into his neck, but he ignored it with long practice. "And by the goddess, he will never mistreat either of you again." He left the alley, feeling Claude's gaze burning into his back long after he reached the infirmary. +_+++++. Seath, fortunately, seemed almost as unhappy as Dmitri himself after he was told the full story. He was displeased by the prince's lack of control over his temper, but punishment that consisted just of 2 weeks' worth of weeding the gardens was a small price to pay for ensuring the ornery soldier would be thoroughly disciplined and reassigned to border duty. Dmitri knew it wasn't very princely of him, but he couldn't help the satisfied smirk he gave when Seath informed the man of Lady Rhea's great displeasure. The soldier turned white as a sheet. To think he had the nerve to abuse the Archbishop's guests behind her back, Seath muttered afterwards, glowering. "I need to speak to the other knights and see how much they knew of or enabled this behavior." Dmitri was quite grateful, both because Cyril and Claude were clearly disturbed by what happened, and because this inspection would likely catch those giving Dede trouble as well. "Thank you, for bringing this to my attention." Seath nodded at him. "Though it would behoove you not to use your fists should this happen again." "Forgive me," Dmitri bowed, contrite. "It's just that, I have been using words alone to defend my friend for the longest time. The frustration I feel in those moments is immense. I hope that as I continue to master my weapons, my emotions will follow." Seath nodded. "See to it. You are dismissed now, dinner will be served shortly, after all." The walk down to the dining hall did wonders to clear his head. Even though he couldn't taste anything these days, some good food from home was always welcome. The warm racket of conversation engulfed him as he entered and went to serve himself. The hunting festival was on, meaning there was enough food for everyone to have seconds. His classmates were already there. Even at the front of the hall, he could hear Annette enthusiastically discussing the dessert menu with Mercedes, Ingrid telling Ash about the new book of tales in the library, and Dede scolding Sylvain for flirting with the maids amidst the chatter of the hall. He stood there for a moment, plate in hand, just trying to absorb that warmth he could feel from everyone present. It made his demons feel far away. It was almost ironic. He had come to the monastery primarily to find out the truth about Dusker, to chase down the one truly responsible for the brutal deaths of his loved ones and end them. Yet even as he worked, he found himself distracted by little things. The cheer of his fellow Blue Lions as they pulled him this way and that way, chasing things that caught their eye. The lazy Wednesdays he spent fishing, not often catching much. His tendency to break things extended to fishing lines, unfortunately, but enjoying himself all the same. The tournaments that allowed him test his skills in an innocent way, harming no one while still imparting valuable experience. It was as if, as long as he stayed here, no voice would trouble him. "There you are." Except perhaps for one. Claude appeared at his side as if out of the ether, beaming brightly and catching his plate before he dropped it in shock. "Been looking for you," he said blithely. "Come in, we saved you a seat." "I what?" "Claude, wait, but I'm not one of the Dimitri's confused protests fell on deaf ears. Claude grabbed his arm and half-tugged, half-dragged him to the far right of the dining hall, where the golden deer claimed their long table. Sure enough, there was an empty seat tucked right between Raphael and the leader's own chair. Claude casually put his plate there and dropped back in front of his own meal, which was almost untouched. "It's the last Friday before our first live training exercise," the brunette said by way of explanation. "Sounds like a reason to celebrate to me. Seeing as you're already a step ahead, why don't you impart your wisdom on our unruly gaggle of misfits?" So it did happen. A white-haired girl, Lysathea, Dmitri was fairly certain that was her name, leaned forward with an eager smile. "You really did knock out that guy harassing Cyril in one punch." Dmitri's ears burned. "Don't tell me everyone's already heard of that," he pleaded. Too late," Hilda von Goneril cackled at his embarrassed face palm. "That was awesome, by the way. That guy is a total creep. He's only at the monastery because my brother kicked him out our household. I heard you knocked his teeth out, and you weren't even wearing gauntlets," Raphael said eagerly. "That's not all, I asked around, and I heard that you lifted an entire carriage by yourself once." "It was for a good cause," Dmitri protested, "my crest aside, physical strength is in my blood. My father he stalled, swallowing hard over the emotions the memory brought up. "My father once lifted a tree off Felix and I after it fell and nearly crushed us. Before that, he told me a story about my grandfather where he carried a foal through the woods so a healer could tend to its leg. It's a family quirk, you could say." "I'd love to hear the stories," Leonie said, stretching before pushing her empty plate toward one of the serving bowls. "Especially if they end with you dropping jerks like rocks." Dmitri sputtered and turned to half-heartedly glare at Claude. The brunette grinned at him, eyes dancing with amusement. Something got stuck in the prince's brain at the sight when he realized he'd never seen that before. Not quite. He was smiling, pleased with himself, and it didn't seem artificial. Guarded, maybe, rooted in Dmitri's current awkwardness, absolutely. But it was real. It changed Claude's whole face. Suddenly everything in his demeanor was playful, welcoming, and the effect of that was immediate and overwhelming. The discomfort he'd so often felt around the man evaporated like morning mist, his lips started moving, and he found himself telling stories he had kept to himself, well, ever since Dusker. About his grandfather. About his father, and stepmother, and Glenn. It amazed him that he still remembered those good times, even though, in moments, he would flash back to that terrible day. The laughter and fascination of the lively people around him drove the images away. It was strange how alike, yet how different the golden deer were from his own lions. They were relaxed in a way noble children weren't. Raphael and Leone casually swore on occasion, while Ignaz was nervous and fascinated by art, twice offering to paint him a picture. Lysathea was obsessed with sweets and Marianne hardly spoke. Hilda, meanwhile, seemed to get a kick out of being as lazy as possible and was proud of it. Lorenz was the most like a noble Dmitri might have met at home, yet his shameless flirting was dangerously akin to Sylvain. Yet they welcomed him without batting an eye. Suddenly Dmitri wondered if this was Claude's strength, that anyone could come to him and his people and feel like they belonged there. That was an incredible power, indeed. And Claude kept drawing him into conversation, through jokes, though casual observations. Once again, the weight of his attention was a felt thing. Dmitri didn't know what to make of it, and there were moments where the young man casually touched him and he just prayed he wasn't as visibly baffled as he felt. What had changed? Surely such a basic kindness as he showed earlier wouldn't be enough to drop the barriers the future Duke Regan had built around himself. Dmitri lost track of time in the midst of this. Dinner ended before he knew it, Dida removing the empty plate in front of him while regarding him very curiously. Claude smiled cheerfully at his retainer and said, "No need to make that face. We were only borrowing him, just one more moment and I'll give him right back." He winked at Dmitri and sauntered out of the room, clearly expecting him to follow. "It's no trouble, Didu," Dmitri assured hastily, scrambling to get up. "I enjoyed myself, actually." He smiled at the golden deer, earning friendly grins in return. "I'll be right back." He left the hall at a jog, a strange hope in his chest that he had earned honesty, somehow, from this morning. Claude wasn't loitering just outside the door. Instead, he waited for Dmitri to emerge and then left down the stairs to the fishing dock and toward the greenhouse. This late in the evening, there was rarely anyone there except for Dida or maybe Bernadetta. Sure enough, it was empty except for them when the door swung shut behind the prince and the duke. "So that was nice," Claude said brightly. "And here I thought you were another boring, stuffy noble. It's good to be wrong sometimes." "Claude," Dmitri sighed, before deciding to cut through to the heart of it. "Was this spurred on by what happened this morning? When we spoke at the table, you mentioned Cyril being harassed, but not yourself. Why?" The brunette raised his arms, linking his fingers behind his head. "You saw why," he responded easily. Dmitri flinched, instantly thinking he'd made a mistake, because those green eyes were cold again. "I'd appreciate it if you didn't spread that around, it's what I wanted to say. People in Fodlan look at outsiders like they're some kind of monster. I've heard everything that jerk said before and more besides, there have even been attempts on my life." "That's," Dmitri stammered, dumbfounded by the implications. "More than one attempt on his life? How was that possible? Was Claude's grandfather unwilling to protect him? How could Claude look so calm while saying that? That's horrible." Claude shrugged. "The scriptures claim the goddess said that no one born in Fodlan belongs outside its borders, and no one born outside was chosen by her." His voice was sour. "Isn't she supposed to be loving and compassionate?" "That's dash." He swallowed his instinctive response hard. "The scripture was written by her children, after Sirio's defeated nemesis. Perhaps they made a mistake. I cannot see the goddess saying such things." "But don't you?" Claude said, dropping his arms and staring intently at him. "You surprised the hell out of me, you know, barging in and defending the honor of two Amirans." "Why would that be surprising?" Dmitri protested, offense bubbling up in his throat. "If he was going there." "A lot of reasons," was the even response. "Yes, he was. You're the prince of the Holy Kingdom of Faergus, your people have the closest relationship to the church out of everyone in Fodlan. You were raised on those scriptures. You have access to sacred rites that the emperor no longer does, after the schism. And you have more reason than most to be wary of outsiders. I figured dash. It's not like that. The words came out like a whip crack. Claude actually jumped back a step at the force of his response. Dusker was a mistake. He let out a harsh breath. If I am to know your most dangerous secret, Claude, in return let me tell you my greatest shame. I do not believe Dusker was responsible for my family's death. The day it happened, the day I lost everyone I loved, the weapons of Dusker are made in particular shapes, distinctive ones, forged in accordance to the will of their gods. The sword that tore my father's arm off was Fodlan made. The arrows that laid Glenn down had no feathers, no ornamentation. I saw men of Dusker struck down trying to help Glenn and I escape the flames. They put their lives down for us. But when I returned home, I failed. I failed to convince my father's council of this. I failed to convey the truth. Claude stared wide-eyed at him. He went on almost maniacally, gesticulating when words failed. My father's men, they lead a massacre of innocent people. Even if men of Dusker had killed my father, the brutality shone upon them. Did his sister, his mother, shopkeepers, farmers, street children. Even if men of Dusker had been responsible, people who would have had no way of knowing it, no way of stopping it, they were all killed. They died because I failed to sway the very people I am meant to rule over. Because it was easier to blame the strange, foreign people of Dusker than attempt to hunt an unknown culprit. Dmitri raked a hand through his hair, letting out a seething sob. Truly, Claude, you may think what you will about me, but do not ever believe I would wish for, or allow, any harm to come to you on account of your Almiran blood. May the goddess have mercy on anyone who tries, because I won't. A very still silence hung in the air. It felt oppressive. Dmitri had told precious few people, after that day, about what he'd seen. Even his fellows in the Blue Lions were largely in the dark. The goddess alone knew why he'd just blurted it all out. Had the words really felt like an accusation? Well, I clearly shouldn't have said that, Claude managed after a minute, and at any other time Dmitri would have marveled at the other teen being so clearly on the back foot. Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that, really, I only figured on understandable distrust and suspicion. You're too much of a knight in shining armor to attack me without provocation. A knight in shining armor, Dmitri wondered. For a man as observant as you don't even suspect? I suppose you simply haven't had the chance. Apologies for that tirade, he said with a sigh. That was immature of me. Seriously. Claude shook his head, his expression softening significantly. Dmitri suddenly felt trapped, a mouse mesmerized by a hawk overhead. You were talking about people going over your head to commit a massacre. I would have been more disturbed if you could talk about that as if it were a mildly interesting day out. He frowned. Don't you realize how ridiculously brave what you did was? You walked into a room full of bloodthirsty, vengeful soldiers in a borderline frenzy and told them they were wrong. That could have ended extremely poorly for you. He raised his palms up. There wasn't much you could have done. You weren't king then, in their eyes, you were just the fragile orphan prince who was confused by his grief. Which is a great comfort to Dusker, I'm sure, Dmitri replied bitterly. I doubt it would be, but it's true. None of what happened is your fault. Claude said in such a matter-of-fact way. The sun was hot, water was wet, it wasn't your fault. Dmitri almost reeled. Hey, Didu is part of your household, right? I guess you've had to defend him from a lot of slander. He actually smiled. I'm flattered someone like me, from the wrong side of the landscape, was worth the trouble. You're correct. Dmitri managed a weak smile in return. Truly, Claude, if any kingdom soldier gives you trouble, please, tell me immediately. I swear I'll deal with it. You're serious? Was there a little wonder in Claude's voice? I should have expected as much from you. Old habits die hard, I guess. If people have honestly tried to kill you over something so petty, you had every right to be wary, Dmitri responded with a shake of his head. If it is your wish, I won't speak of your heritage. Though, perhaps someday you won't have to worry over people knowing. Someday, when fish can fly and stars can be woven into crowns, Claude deadpanned, but there was no bite in his voice. I guess you can stop wondering why I look like Cyril now. Oh, that. He was a little embarrassed to be reminded of that comment he'd made earlier in the month. Honestly, I'd meant to remark on how, if he was blessed by the same arcane magic that touched you at birth, he'd grow up to be quite handsome. Yet I only managed to make you anxious instead. I'm sorry. Arcane magic. Claude parried, blinking rapidly. What exactly is the context for that? Well, it's your Almiran blood, I realize now. It makes you incredibly striking, Dimitri said in all seriousness. Something about your skin and your eyes, truly, when I first saw you, I thought you'd stepped out of an old northern fable about a star that fell to Fodlan and took on human form. An image that was somewhat tarnished the moment you opened your mouth, but not completely. It's no wonder it's so easy for you to charm people. He expected a joke, a laugh, to be teased, any number of things in response to something that he realized the instant after he spoke the words could be construed as a clumsy and shamelessly direct flirtation. Instead, however, he was greeted with the unusual sight of Claude von Regan stunned completely speechless. The brunette's mouth moved silently, green eyes full of a cascading emotion Dimitri wasn't sure he could name. The silence stretched on for several moments, until the prince could finally bear it no more. You say such pretty things, the brunette said at last, cutting off his worried inquiry. A small smile broke across his face. Small, yes, but brilliantly warm, one that made his expression glow. You know, if you did something with that unruly hair of yours, you'd be getting lots of attention yourself. Dimitri felt his face turn burning red. Ah, is that right? He ran a self-conscious hand through his eternally unmanageable locks. I'll have to consider that. Heh, Claude's laugh rang through the empty greenhouse, stirring it to life. Is that his real smile? Goddess, it's amazing. I've detained you long enough, we better get back before Dida starts to think I've kidnapped you. We leave with the princess for live training tomorrow, don't we? He winked. I'll see you then. With that, the enigmatic Regenair slipped out of the building, leaving a slightly flustered and very contemplative Dimitri in his wake. It's like he's a different person. No, that's not quite right. It's not that he changed, it's that he felt safe. Dimitri looked down at his hands. It must be lonely, living as a child of two worlds, kept only in one or the other. But what does that mean for us? Can we be friends, Claude von Regan? Would you feel safe being friends with the Boar Prince? Chapter 2. The one time I run into bandits hungry or stupid enough to try and murder royalty, I get paired up with two rulers who don't know how to beat a strategic retreat, Claude thought dryly when he glanced over his shoulder and realized he had not, in fact, managed to slip off and circle about on his own. Dimitri and Edelgard were right behind him, and as a consequence, so were the bandits. Sheesh, do Fodlan generals teach anything besides charging straight ahead? Or maybe Dimitri saw him disappear, thought he was using himself as a decoy, and was too bloody noble for his own good. That sounds about right. The thought gave him a mix of amusement and a really irritating backflip in his chest. Gah, this is not the time. Claude, Dimitri gasped out after nearly crashing into a tree, where are we going? The bandits' shouting was getting closer, give it another few minutes and those axe-wielding nutjobs would be right on top of them. Remire, he shouted back, hurry up. That's just a tiny farming village. Edelgard said incredulously. If we go there, we'll only involve the civilians. You need to keep up with the chatter, he chided her, stomping on his annoyance. It was strange on the face of it. Lately, Remire's been the favorite haunt of the Ashen Demon and their fellow mercenaries, and that's not a fight some run-out-of-the-mill bandit wants to pick. The Ashen Demon. Dimitri parried, matching his pace with his own as an arrow whipped past, missing them both by a foot. Claude, that mercenary. All the stories say that person has no feelings, no pity, no remorse, nothing. Even if they were sympathetic, we have little gold to offer. If you've got a better idea, I'd love to hear it, Claude rasped as they burst out of the trees into a dimly lit field. Otherwise, run now and argue strategy later. Dimitri choked out a frustrated sentence in what Claude suspected was old Fodlanes but kept up regardless, repeatedly glancing back to make sure they weren't losing Edelgard. Fortunately, despite the surprise attack she hadn't gotten hurt at all, only startled awake. Claude, meanwhile, suspected he had bruised ribs judging by the pain radiating from his side. Dimitri's hand was balled into a fist to slow the bleeding in his palm, which still had an arrowhead embedded in it. Claude would give that bandit leader this much credit: it was the first time someone had tried to murder him in his sleep for a while. Fortunately, experience had taught him to keep a knife under his pillow, so he'd been able to slice the tendon of the foot pinning him and free himself before the axe came down on his neck. Granted, he'd had to immediately throw said knife at the bandit choking Dimitri. It caught the guy in the back of the neck, dropping him. Edelgard then shoved the corpse off of him and the three of them were able to grab their weapons. Of course, they'd quickly been overwhelmed by the sheer number of bandits, including 2 archers, and he'd known they'd had to run for it. Alois was nowhere in sight, nor was the honor guard. A fire in the distance suggested they'd been lured away. With that in mind, Claude had recalled their last location on the map, and the map itself, it must be said, and drew up a plan as quickly as his tired and pain-addled mind would allow. The Ashen Demon, really, the name was half a myth. Stories trickled in from traveling merchants and artists about a cold, emotionless mercenary who could carve through dozens of enemies with no more effort than dicing vegetables. Of a single swordsman, woman, facing immense odds and walking out the other side with a nail embedded in one foot in a ship full of corpses to show for it. It was virtually impossible to tell fact from fiction, but after villagers from Remire mentioned the individual repeatedly in the same breath as the mercenary band that had taken to regularly visiting their home, well, he'd planned to investigate under less frantic circumstances, but beggars couldn't be choosers. They crossed the first plain, then cut across the second one, where the town's iron-wrought gate were illuminated by torches and the late evening sky. Thankfully, they were still open. Good, there had been a couple of moments in running where he'd thought he'd faint from the pain radiating from his side. Plus we really need to do something about Dimitri's hand. Hopefully the town had a cleric who could tend to him. Hey! Ah, the gods of fortune were smiling on them after all. Rushing through the gates nearly caused him to run right into a pair of men in upscale leather armor and golden earrings. Mercenaries who were skilled enough to thrive in the business showed off their wealth in subtle ways. Be it jewelry, silver weapons, or the latest armor, the more expensive their equipment, the longer they'd been around. And long-lived mercenaries were as valuable as any anointed knight. What's going on out there? Dimitri staggered to a stop just inside the village, wheezing and clutching his wrist. Claude circled back around to him and grimaced, grabbing his arm when the prince tried to hide the injury in his cloak. The blood seeping out of his impaled palm was getting thick enough to stain most of his hand. "Please tell me you didn't rip the arrowhead out," he said a bit sarcastically. "I needed my hands free," Dimitri protested. His face was significantly paler than normal, visible even in the low light of the torch. He tried to flex his hand and flinched, grimacing. "I can't use my lance otherwise. If you'd left it there, it would have staunched the bleeding and you wouldn't have given yourself muscle trauma. Seriously, don't Fodlan nobles know anything about how to handle war wounds? You can't use your lance if you pass out from blood loss." Dimitri shook his head. "It's fine, Claude, I've fought with worse than this. You can't rely solely on adrenaline to stay conscious. Do that, and you only need to stop for a moment, or get distracted once, before you're too lightheaded to do anything but collapse. I can cover you against 3 or 4 of them, maybe, if I had a good bow and favorable terrain, but if you pass out in the middle of the field I can't fight and carry you. I take it you kids are in trouble," one of the mercenaries said dryly, causing Dimitri to start and Edelgard to make an exasperated noise. Claude turned back to the twosome and noted that they both had visible scars, and similar-looking ones to boot. So either they were working as a pair, or they were part of a company that was currently in town. The other took a step closer and hissed at the sight of Dimitri's hand. "Damn, that's nasty. You were ambushed, weren't you?" "Yes, they came while we were asleep," Dimitri said, quickly burying his surprise under his usual princely demeanor. "Forgive us, this was the only place we could reach with them right on our heels." Distant shouts echoed across the plains behind them. "There were too many of them for us. We are still in training, after all." The 2 mercenaries looked at each other for a moment, then out at the plains. "Hell, they look like kids," the first one sighed. "More pro bono work. Well, whatever, We needed to break in the new horses at some point. I'll go get Captain Geralt and his girl, his friend said, glancing at Dmitri. She'll be able to take care of his hand. The first one snorted. She can do that and a whole lot more. I know. I try not to think about that sometimes. With that totally not ominous remark hanging in the air, the man disappeared up the road. That gave Claude a moment to address something that was bothering him. Hey, Dmitri, remind me, how did you end up with an arrowhead in your hand? Did one of the bandits use it in place of a knife? He hadn't seen the guy he'd managed to knock off holding an arrow, but maybe he'd been looking from a wrong angle. Oh, Dmitri blinked, and shook his head. A look of unease crossed his face. No. I had a premonition, I guess. I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye and brought my hand up in front of my face. You need better gauntlets, Claude said, his voice carefully dry and observant. A premonition? Is that what you call those little things you try so hard not to react to? A little thing visceral enough to make you throw your hand in front of your face, inadvertently saving yourself? Can you not buy anything hardier than the standard handouts all students get from the blacksmith? Dmitri looked ruefully down at his trembling, bloody hand. I came here with a limited allowance, the same as you, I wager, seeing as you have little to no armor at all. Claude rolled his eyes a bit. Has anyone told you you're too bloody noble for your own good? I'm an archer. If I let people get close enough to stab me, I'm already up a creek. Truly talented archers are capable of firing point blank, Edelgard said, her tone slightly lofty. It's considered an important skill in the Empire. Something worth considering, perhaps. Claude made a production of looking contemplative. Before he could fire off a witty retort, the crunch of feet on the gravel and a booming baritone heralded the arrival of their saviors. What's the situation? The old man asked. He had the voice of someone who was used to being obeyed, someone who demanded respect, and someone who did not suffer fools lightly. The three of them basically turned around as one, as sure as if one of the teachers had caught them misbehaving. Claude's first impression of Geralt the Blade Breaker was holy shit, are you actually a walking mountain, because the man towered over him even more than Nader or his own father. His blue eyes were steely and impassive as they swept over him, Dmitri and Edelgard, assessing them, deciding whether or not this was a trap. He wore heavy leather and fur, with a lance strapped over his shoulder and a sword at his belt. Also, he looked muscular enough to bodily lift Marianne with his left hand and Hilda with his right without even breaking a sweat. Scars cut rough edges into his rugged face, old and faded ones that spoke of many hard-won battles. Claude could admit to feeling a little bit of awe, just as his eyes slid to the figure right behind him and the world tilted quite suddenly. A lithe silent shadow trotted to a halt at her father's bored shoulder, impassive blue eyes meeting his evenly with the barest hint of curiosity. She was freakishly tall as well, having at least 3 inches on both him and Dmitri, which was just unfair, and slender figure built solely of hard muscle and smooth, tempting curves that even the loose-fitted robes of a sword master couldn't conceal. She had a blade buckled to her belt, a quiver, and a cheap but reliable bow slung over her shoulder. Dark blue hair swept down to her pale neck, cut practically short and pinned away from her face by silver clasps, the only thing she seemed to possess that was at all expensive. The scars she had that he could see, tracing sharp lines across her collarbone, circling the crown of her head, and nicking her jaw, hardly detracted from the divine sight. Nah, they enhanced it. Did she have more, concealed by those long sleeves? Whoa, down Prince-Ealing. Your Almiran tastes are showing. Admittedly, her complete lack of expression was distracting enough that he didn't say or do anything ill-advised with her scowling father standing right in front of him. Forgive our intrusion. We wouldn't bother you if the situation weren't dire, Dmitri said, keeping an admirable straight face even though Claude bloody well knew he'd had to mentally pick his jaw up off the ground. A quick glance at Edelgard and what do you know, they were all in agreement about something. The living mountain, the captain, Geralt, was it that Geralt? The famed captain of the knights. Raised a solitary eyebrow. What are a couple of kids like you doing out at this hour? We're being pursued by some bandits. I can only hope you'd be willing to lend your support. Dmitri bowed politely, Claude amused himself by imagining Akiran throwing a shrieking fit at the mere thought of showing respect and deference to someone of lower social standing. If the prince who lives and breathes chivalry can humble himself without complaint, what does that make you, weasel? It's true. Edelgard jumped in, gazing exclusively at the girl. We were resting in camp when they jumped us. We've been separated from our companions, and we're outnumbered, he tossed in casually. They're after our lives, not to mention our gold. The swordswoman tilted her head, then walked forward in silent steps and took hold of Dimitri's injured hand. She frowned, studying the gory wound for a long moment, before placing her other palm over it. Claude was pretty damn surprised when a flare of white magic surrounded the prince's bloody skin, wiping away the injury as though it had never been. Okay, since when do physically inclined fighters have aptitude for faith magic? Thank you, Dimitri said gratefully, flexing his fingers easily in wonder. Claude is injured as well, one of the bandits tried to kick his ribs in. Without a word of acknowledgement, her attention swung straight over to him. If he swallowed when she placed her hand on his side, pretty face lightly bent with concentration, he blamed it on the disorienting run and lack of sleep. The blessed warmth washing the pain away also made for a half-decent story. I'm surprised you're so calm, considering the situation, the captain said dryly. Something changed in his expression when he looked closer at them. Wait, that uniform. Captain Geralt, sir. Another mercenary ran up to them, panting for breath. Bandits have surrounded the village. The ones south are trying to start fires. We've moved the civilians further in, but dash. Right. I'm on my way. Geralt rubbed the back of his neck, letting out a tired sigh. The mercenary nodded and darted off the way he'd came, taking the two from earlier with him. All bark and no brains, these ones. He turned to his daughter and said without preamble, Kid, you see that? He pointed out the front gates. The bandits had left the forest and were making their way towards them. She nodded once. He smirked at that and said, Good. You're in charge here. No one gets in, no one falls, and these three are your responsibility. I'll take care of the fires. Wait, what? Claude said blankly. Geralt ignored him, whistling sharply. A large grey stallion shot up the road to his side. Without breaking stride, he grabbed the bridle and saddled up before the animal even came to a stop. Then he vanished towards the smoke, leaving just the four of them to protect the entrance to town. He can't seriously expect you to fight alone. Dimitri blurted in surprise. There have to be at least 9 of them, my lady. She strode past him, out to the mouth of the gates, one hand dropping easily to her sword hilt. Pausing in the grass, head tilted slightly, she waited, fingers idly tapping against the weapon's guard. After a tense moment of silent planning, she turned around and openly sized them up. What little light had been in her eyes the moment before was gone, replaced by a blank coolness. You. His pulse jumped quite without his permission at that rich, resonant contralto. That was an incredibly deep voice for a girl no older than him. Do you have anything to defend yourself with up close? Claude shook his head and gave her his most charming smile. Unfortunately, I lost my knife in a bandit's neck a while back. She drew her sword, a good steel blade, well maintained, and pointed at a thicket further up the plain. That's your vantage point. Take out anyone you can reach, I will cover you. Her gaze swung over to Edelgard. You, take him, she nodded at Dimitri, and make yourself visible further to the right. Let them come to you, and fight together. If one of you gets injured, retreat into the thicket and make use of these. She pulled a number of familiar-looking vials out of her coat. Concoctions, unless Claude missed his guess. She shook them pointedly, causing the royals to quit staring and accept the gift. The cover will provide you a few seconds of reprieve. It may limit your movement, however, so bear that in mind. She glanced at Claude and said very matter-of-factly, I will go out ahead and engage them. Your job is to hit them, and try not to hit me. Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked away. Get going. They're almost on us. It was almost hilarious how all 3 of them immediately scrambled to obey. Claude would have liked to blame flashbacks to Judith and her frequent use of what he called her listen, brat, and listen well voice, That flat order was almost as intimidating despite the lack of an age gap. He reached the tree with no problems, his head was much clearer without constantly spiking pain to distract him. The blue-haired teen, damn it, he hadn't gotten her fucking name, raced ahead of him, attracting the attention of 3 enemies. The 9 bandits were spread out, the biggest and baddest of them, and thus likely the boss, hanging back with 2 goons flanking him. A few headed off toward Dimitri and Edelgard, but the others seemed to figure that the single woman made for an easier target. He took out an arrow, notched it and waited. The mysterious girl's first opponent swung his axe in a wild arc. She jerked her blade up, catching it in the curve and wrenching the weapon from his grip, sending it flying into the grass. Immediately she lashed out, driving her foot into his gut and sending him a few steps backward, before bringing her sword down. The blade hacked across his face and dug into his chest. His choked scream indicated she'd hit a lung. She drew back and cut sideways, slicing open his throat. Blood splattered her gauntlets as he fell to the ground. She stepped over her prey without pausing, the battle over in mere moments, approaching the 2 behind him with easy grace. Letting out a sharp breath, he aimed for one and, keeping movement in mind, fired. She didn't even flinch at the arrow tearing past her to hit one of her enemies dead in the eye. She shifted her stance accordingly and ducked under a graceless swing aimed at her head. Her sword turned sharply and sliced the tendons on the brigand's leg, bringing him down to one knee as she reoriented herself. If her sword biting into the neck didn't kill the man, then the arrow buried in his collarbone did. Flicking her blade in a gesture that was a bit too deliberate to be contemptuous, she stowed the weapon away and slung the bow off her back. A roar from further up the field told him what she'd seen. The boss's 2 goons were charging. She casually strung 2 arrows and fired. It was a bit far from where he stood, but he was pretty sure she hit one of them in the thigh and the stomach, dropping him before he got within a dozen feet of her. She jumped back a foot as his partner approached, bow pointed straight at the man's face. Perfect point-blank firing posture. She was highly proficient in at least 2 weapon types, enough to transfer between them without breaking stride. He felt a twinge of inadequacy even as his 3rd arrow struck home, staggering the brigand right before she put an arrow through his throat. The tides of battle turn rapidly, don't they? He thought with perhaps more glee than necessary. Hey, just because he was familiar with murder attempts didn't mean he didn't resent them. His thoughts were interrupted by a high, familiar string of whistled notes. His heart sped up. Gods, how many times had he heard Nader use that old standby? Her troop must have spent some time in Almira. That signal meant that there was a change in plans without any dialogue getting lost in the chaos of the battlefield. He stepped out of the tree's shade. She nodded, the gesture barely visible, before gesturing sharply toward Edelgard and Dimitri. The royals were managing, though they seemed to be flagging a bit. Dimitri had gotten himself hurt, again. Judging by the way he was holding his lance, and Edelgard seemed to be favoring one leg. The girl pointed to a tree closer to them and then darted off, sword in hand. Really, the brigand stood no chance. He was too preoccupied with Dimitri to notice the girl coming up behind him. Just as Claude reached the tree, he watched her smash the hit of her sword into the enemy face, likely obliterating his jaw, given the cringe-inducing crack he could hear despite the distance, allowing Dimitri to shove his lance into the gut and finish him off. With her managing the prince, Claude took aim again and took out the knee of Edelgard's opponent. He crashed to the ground and was promptly decapitated. Is that all of Dash? No, of course not, the boss. The man was making his way toward them, clutching a throwing axe in one hand. Yeah, because that worked out so well for your friends. Claude whistled sharply, getting the girl's attention. If he was the big man in charge, he'd probably be harder to kill than his grunts. She drove the tip of her sword into the ground, slung her bow off her back and fired. The first shot went wide, but as the man turned to face her directly, the second shot glanced off his arm and a third one sank into his stomach. He didn't fall like the others, clearly he had some actual armor. Claude debated trying to go for a headshot, but the brigand was running away from him and toward his companions, so it wouldn't do to miss. Fortunately, she didn't need help. She just dropped her bow, pulled her sword free of the dirt and feinted left. His attack missed her as she danced aside and swung her sword upward, slicing his nose judging by the murky screech that followed it. Again she spun past his sloppy retaliation, crouching and cashing into him with her full weight. When he hit the ground, she reversed her grip on her sword and slammed it into his face once, twice, 3 times. Then paused. A few seconds went by. Claude licked his dry lips and silently lamented his weakness for men and women who could take him on in a straight fight. After yesterday, that is so unfair. Why show me a menu I can't eat from? The girl got up, casually wiping her sword on the body of her last victim. Something prickled at the back of Claude's brain, the ease, the casualness of it. She wasn't even injured, was she? He stepped out into the open again, walking over to Dimitri and Edelgard where they stood aside from the bodies. It was all over except for the bleeding. Done, her voice broke the early morning silence. Their rescuer was kneeling in the mud, collecting her bow. She still had a few arrows left, by contrast, his own quill was empty. Or are you uninjured? Dimitri managed, somehow sounding both awestruck and almost wary within the same breath. I'm fine, she replied absently, examining her weapon with a frown. Damn, the string is broken again. That's a nuisance. He suppressed a chuckle and asked, is that all you have to say? Her eyes turned to him, cool and empty except for the faintest curiosity. Was she carved from stone? That's an awfully subdued reaction from someone who cut down 5 bandits in as many minutes. Technically, 2 of those kills were yours, she responded with a shrug. Your support was appreciated, I was able to escape without injury this time. She looked over at Dimitri and Edelgard. You all acquitted yourself quite well, for amateurs. Claude's burst of laughter was almost involuntary. It wasn't often that someone casually dissed the 3 most important heirs on the continent. Ah, you got us there. Oh dear. Claude. Dimitri groaned in exasperation, though his voice had much less bite in it than it might have a week ago. That's no way to show gratitude. He bowed with a wink. I assure you, I am entirely grateful to our glorious war goddess. She shifted on one foot, blinking rapidly. It's because of you I'm not dead right now. Thanks for that. He smiled playfully. I'd heard there were mercenaries lingering in Remire, but I didn't think you were this good. That's true, Edelgard mused, regarding the girl intently. Claude was finally about to ask for her name when a yell cut them off. Somehow, considering how freaking bloody his face was, the brigand leader was back on his feet. And he was running straight for the princess. Something rippled in the air, he could swear it, he felt something shift, could taste magic like ozone surrounding them as thick as rain. But in a blink, the girl moved again, throwing herself in front of Edelgard and catching her sword in the curve of the man's axe. She jerked backward, wrenching the weapon away from its wielder and launching it somewhere in the woods. The brigand staggered backwards, breath heaving, staring at her. You, he gurgled, it's you. That soulless creature, the ashen demon. Claude heard Dimitri suck in a sharp breath next to him, a chill of vindication swept over the alarm and surprise that had ruled him only moments ago. The girl, however, merely sighed. My father warned me that name would stick, she remarked with tired irritation. She brought her bloody steel blade up and pointed it at his chest. You should have played dead. Goodbye. A death threat had never sounded so gentle and serene. Evidently, that was too much for the brigand, because he turned and booked it, fleeing into the forest like a terrified child. The girl, as soon as he was gone, smacked her palm against her forehead. Bloody stupid, basic mistake, she berated herself. Cut off the head, sever limbs, and if you don't do that, always check for breathing. Goddess damn it. She looked back at Edelgard. I'm sorry. That was sloppy of me. Edelgard recovered quickly for someone who'd nearly been gutted, and shook her head earnestly. He took several blows to the face. That would stop most men. Please, don't trouble yourself. You saved me, again. The neigh of a horse cut Dimitri's concern off. Geralt appeared from the village. Looking at the sky showed that the smoke was clearing up. He must have come as soon as he finished up on his end. That was, Byleth, did you just... He looked worried. Huh. That was weird. And the weirder thing was, she kind of looked confused too. Naturally, after everything was over and questions were laying thick in the air, that was when Alois thundered into the clearing, the knights at his side, bellowing about how justice had arrived. "We shall cut you down for terrorizing our students." He raised his axe triumphantly, only to be thwarted by the empty clearing and fleeing bandits. "Wait, they're getting away. After them." Claude rolled his eyes and called out cheerfully, "Sir Louis. You missed all the excitement." Dimitri face-palmed, and he could just hear Edelgard rolling her eyes at him. "The girl, Byleth," Gerald called her, tensed up, one hand dropping to her sword. Gerald groaned as Louis hurried towards them. He dismounted and placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "It's all right, kid. He's no threat." She relaxed, before offering up her broken bow with an apologetic look. "Don't worry about that, I'd been meaning to buy you a new one anyhow." Louis skidded to a halt in front of the mountain of a man, eyes widening comically. "See Captain Geralt? Is that you? Goodness, it's been ages." Byleth started visibly. "Wasn't that interesting? Don't you recognize me?" "It's Louis. Your old right-hand man. At least, that was how I thought of myself. It must have been, 20 years ago when you vanished without a trace. I always knew you were still alive." Gerald sighed. "You haven't changed a bit, Louis, just as loud as ever." Claude smothered a snicker in his hand. Dimitri tried to look disapproving, but the twitch of his lip betrayed him. "And drop that captain nonsense. I'm not your captain anymore. These days I'm just a wandering mercenary. One who has work to do." He nodded. "You've got the kids back unharmed, you'd better return to the school. I'll see you around, old friend." He made to walk off. Byleth looked back and forth, then tried to follow him. Sarah Louise spluttered a bit, before saying, "Wait. This is not how this conversation ends. I insist that you come back to the monastery with me." Gerald stopped walking and stood very, very still. Claude's eyes narrowed. So Gerald hadn't gone missing, he'd chosen to leave without explanation, leaving everything he'd known, and everything he'd gained as the most prestigious knight of Syros, without a backwards glance. The man's body language screamed that he didn't want to go back, but he had no way to refuse without looking suspicious as hell. Yet another mystery dangled just out of his reach, begging to be solved. As if he didn't have enough to dig through, especially now. Why are Fodlan's borders closed? Where do the relics come from? The riddle of Duskar's tragedy, and now, why did the strongest man who ever lived run away from the church? Byleth walked over and placed a hand on her father's wrist. The gesture was small and concerned, and it was the most visible emotion he'd seen from her since the start. "Garegmok Monastery," Geralt enunciated heavily. He looked at her for a moment, then shook his head. "I guess this was inevitable." "And one more," Claude added with perhaps greater curiosity than the rest, "what happened to his daughter that she seems less alive than the statues of the saints?" Chapter 3. As much as she could say she had emotions, Byleth was quite confounded. Her father was, with the exception of her mother, not a sentimental man. It had never struck her as odd that he didn't talk about his past. She'd never felt the need to ask, she'd never felt much of anything, where he'd come from before her birth, or why they never lingered in one place for very long. He avoided the church in spite of how precious faith was to members of their own team, so she followed his lead. He never did things without a reason. Why did it matter where he'd come from? He was there with her, that was all that mattered. Or so she'd thought. Her mind was whirling as her father vanished back into Remire with that night, to inform the band of their change in plans. Her father had been a captain, an immensely important man, and now they were going somewhere he would rather avoid. He seemed resigned to it. Why not refuse? Why did he leave in the first place? What in the seventh hell was happening? And after that happened earlier. The girl Edelgard, the power, Suthies. Byleth bit her lip hard, something indescribable was bubbling violently in her chest and it greatly discomforted her. Though perhaps that was only to be expected, since she had nearly died. It wasn't the first time she'd brushed with death, she'd been fighting alongside her father ever since she was old enough to properly wield a sword. But it was the first time she would have died for sure without intervention, divine intervention, at that. The thought was discomforting, for lack of any better descriptor. She reached up and rubbed her left shoulder, she couldn't quite reach the place near her spine where the axe would have come down. There was a twinge of phantom pain there, an ache just strong enough to gnaw at the back of her mind. "It will not linger over long," a familiar girl's voice promised. "'Tis merely an echo of what might have been. You did live through the moment, after all." Byleth bit her lip, letting her hand fall down to her side. "I see," she thought back at the strange green-haired girl she'd dreamed of all her life. Suthies hummed. "It is a good thing. That would have been a shameful way to go, would it not?" "Would it have been truly shameful to die saving another?" Byleth asked in turn, wondering. It was true she did not know Edelgard, but to imply that her life was not worth saving, even at great expense, well, the thought did not sit right with her. "It is a far greater thing to live for another than to die for them," Suthies responded sternly, the childish amusement gone from her voice. "If you are to forget everything else I say to you, you must remember that above all. Promise me that right now." "I swear it," Byleth responded quickly and seriously, bewildered by the sudden change in mood. Suthies was mercurial, lazy, and sharp-tongued, but her moods up to this point had been playful, exasperated and contemplative. To invoke such a tone must be intentional, to add more weight to the words. She did not know what manner of spirit the girl was, a guardian spoken of in Brigid's myths. A lord of the rising dawn as described by Almira? A sky god of Duskar? An emissary of Fodlan's goddess, but it was clear that she was older than her appearance suggested, and likely more powerful than Byleth could imagine. Only a fool ignored the warnings of the divine. "Good," Suthies responded, pleased, her demeanor reverting as quickly as it had changed. "I shall hold you to that, Byleth Eisner." She chuckled lightly. "Ah, it seems your presence is required. Get going." Blinking, Byleth cast her eyes about, instinctively looking for her father. There was no sign of him, however. Instead, her eyes fell upon the three lordlings they had saved, all of whom were clearly watching her. Edelgard smiled and gestured lightly with one hand, asking without words for a moment of her time in an almost coy manner. She paused. As a rule, her father handled contracts and business. But this wasn't such, was it? No doubt a couple of young aristocrats who'd just suffered a near-death experience would feel inclined to keep a powerful warrior close by, especially if this was the first time they'd realized they could, in fact, die violently just as the common person did. There was little she had to offer in the way of conversation, and her instinct was to wait until her father returned. But, they were young as her, perhaps younger. Byleth spent precious little time around anyone outside her fellow mercenaries, all of whom were, if not peers of her father, older than her by a not insignificant margin. Perhaps, it couldn't hurt to see what they wanted? Hesitantly, she made her way over to them. "I appreciate your help back there," the silver-haired axe maiden said with impeccable politeness. Her purple eyes swept over Byleth in a way that made her skin tingle, a sensation she couldn't even begin to explain. "Your skill is without question. The Ashen Demon, I must confess, I had thought you to be a myth. A combination of various mercenary teams attributed to a single individual. Obviously, I was wrong." "It is no trouble," Byleth hedged uncertainly. "My father doesn't like that name much. It is not used as a selling point." "Your father, that would be Geralt the Blade Breaker, wouldn't it?" Edelgard assumed a thinking pose. "Former captain of the Knights of Syros, often praised as the strongest man who ever lived. Am I missing anything?" "I didn't know he was a captain," she said honestly, feeling as much up in the air as when she'd ridden with the mercenary Hannah on a borrowed Pegasus. Edelgard blinked in surprise. "How curious. I'd wager the explanation for that is fascinating indeed." "Hey," Claude interjected, smiling brightly at her. Byleth turned slightly toward the archer. "Isn't that strange? His expression is so warm, yet his eyes are closed off from me. You are coming with us to the monastery, right?" "Of course you are. I'd love to bend your ear as we travel." "You want to talk to me," Byleth thought in confusion. "Aren't you unnerved by me? Isn't that why that smile of yours isn't quite sincere?" Perhaps it was a matter of honor. Nobles were often quite hung up on that. It would be rude to blatantly ignore her after she'd saved his life, so he would speak to her despite her disturbing disposition? "Oh, I should mention that the three of us are students at Gareg Mach Monastery. We were doing some training exercises when those bandits attacked. He raised both his hands. On average, I'd say it was my third most disastrous camping trip. Third. Dmitri, the blonde knightly young man, repeated blankly. Dare I ask what you're ranking above us, nearly having our throats slit in our sleep? Claude chuckled. Maybe some other time. It's up there, though, if only because I was the only one who knew how to beat a strategic retreat. He sighed. Alas, I looked back and found every single one of those bandits chasing the three of us, leaving me to improvise. Again. Dmitri's eye twitched. So that's what you were doing? And here I thought you were being a decoy for the sake of us all. Pray tell, how was I supposed to interpret that amidst the perfectly rational panic we were experiencing? His intentions were as clear as day, Edelgard replied chidingly. Byleth decided that the three must know each other quite well to bicker so easily after having nearly lost their lives. You will prove a lacking ruler if you cannot see the truth behind a person's words. Wait. What? Ruler? Distracted from remonstrating his comrade, Dmitri chuckled lightly and retorted, You will prove a lacking ruler yourself if you look for deceit behind every word and fail to trust the people around you. Ruler. An able ruler. Byleth didn't quite have the words for the sinking feeling in her stomach when she looked between Edelgard and Dmitri, various memories twigging in her brain about how the Empire and the kingdom's current heirs were her age, a boy and a girl, not yet at their majority, who quite possibly were sent off to finish their studies before taking the throne. You fought well for amateurs, her own words rang in her head like a roaring fire. She swallowed in a hopefully unobtrusive way. Oh goddess, did I just sass the Prince of Faergus and the Princess of Adrestia? After ordering them around like common mercenaries? Oh joy, a royal debate between their highnesses, Claude snarked. Byleth felt her face burn and resisted the urge to bolt for her father. Yes, I have. A musical giggle did nothing to soothe her newfound anxiety. Suthies, the cruel wretch, was laughing at her. If they held a grudge, her father and their troop could be blacklisted in both kingdoms. There was nothing funny about this. I wonder how being predictable affects one's ability to rule. His grin took on a sharper, teasing edge. As the embodiment of distrust, I'd say your little exchange is rather idealistic. Both heirs pivoted to scowl at him. Me, idealistic? Edelgard demanded, indignant. Tell me, are you physically incapable of keeping quiet, or is your lack of self-awareness a condition of some sort? Is that so wrong, Claude? Dmitri asked, looking exasperated. It might do you well to be less suspicious yourself. Byleth's eyes darted between the three lordings, between the prince and Princess Arguet, wondering if she should take this chance to escape. Once they recovered, they might forget all about her in favor of arguing over who should have done what during the attack. Ah, but forgive our digression, no dice, Dmitri returned his attention to her at that very moment. I must speak with you, if you could spare a moment. Byleth might have sighed, if she was capable of much expression. Here we go, she thought in resignation. The way you held your ground against the bandits' leader was captivating, the prince said earnestly, causing her to blink twice. What? You never lost control of the situation. You're an immensely capable woman, it showed me I still have much to learn. What? Your skill is precisely why I must ask you to consider lending your skill to the Empire, Edelgard said confidently. Byleth blinked again, the bewilderment she felt ratcheting up beyond anything she'd ever experienced before. I might as well tell you now, I am no mere student. In truth Halt, Edelgard, Dmitri interrupted, looking affronted. At least allow me to finish my own proposition. He bowed to her. Him, a prince, bowed to a common, disturbed mercenary. She felt warmth in her cheeks and resisted the odd urge to tug at her hair. The holy kingdom of Faergus is in dire need of exceptional individuals like yourself. Please, do consider returning to the kingdom with me. Byleth shot a quick glance at the treeline, just to make sure the sun was, in fact, rising in the east. Because what else could possibly explain this? Whoa, there. Claude laughed, giving his two companions a mock disapproving stare. Trying to recruit someone you just met, tactless, really. Byleth's relief lasted roughly 3 seconds before he followed that up with, I was personally planning to develop a deep and lasting friendship on our way back to the monastery before begging for favors. He shrugged dramatically and gave her another intimately friendly smile. But it seems there's no time for niceties in this world. So, capable stranger, where does your allegiance lie? It sounded like a joke, but how could she be sure of that? I'm a mercenary, she protested, amazed that her voice remained as calm and even as ever. I swear by the sword before politics. I have no permanent home, and I move where the job takes me. I cannot answer that. Racking her brain, she tried to think of something to say that would satisfy at least one of the absurdly powerful teenagers in front of her. I am a sword for hire. Whenever a moment arises, I am at your disposal. Myself and my father, that is. She waited for a response for an agonizingly long second. Claude responded first, by clapping, a clever answer, and one that fits the job, he said playfully. It's a hard bargain, though. The two of you together are an expensive prospect. What would it cost just for you? Byleth's pulse jumped. That so rarely happened, despite her skill, attempts to poach her from Geralt's mercenaries were rare. She unnerved people with her coldness, her lack of expression, the lack of humanity. Why didn't he? Those eyes are deep and dark, mysterious as the ocean. What is it that he desires when he looks at me? I'm so unfamiliar with this. I don't know what to do. Father, help me. There you are. The loud knight's voice came to her rescue, at least for the moment. They turned to see her father and the man, Sarah Louise, standing just a few feet away. Come, it's time for us to go. I know you're likely tired, but it's better that we return to the monastery as soon as possible. I doubt your attackers will come back for a second go-around, Geralt contributed, arms crossed, but concerning you three, it's better safe than sorry. We're about ready to move out, if necessary, you can rest in the supply carts on the way. Got it, Claude said blithely. Guess we'll pick this up another time. Byleth let out a breath and headed over to her father. He squeezed her arm, smiling sympathetically at her. It restored her equilibrium somewhat. I can ask him on the way, surely. My, everyone is in such a hurry, Suthies said with a yawn. You know, each of them is most unique. It's true, Byleth acknowledged, glancing over her shoulder at the three lords. They were following behind her, talking amongst themselves again, but still clearly keeping her in their sights. Claude, he's welcoming, yet guarded. He has not shared his true self with me, or perhaps anyone. Dimitri, everything he does, all his movements, in battle and off, are carefully controlled. He's very sincere, yet something is weighing on him. And Edelgard, she's refined, yet she looks at me the way a blacksmith regards a fine sword. Carefully judging, wondering what the price is. Yes, I thought the same, Suthies mused. Something significant has happened here, Byleth. It means something, I must sleep on this. You need to sleep on bloody everything, Byleth grumbled. Suthies did not dignify that with a response. Roughly 2 hours later, Byleth realized she had greatly underestimated Claude's tenacity, Edelgard's fascination, and Dimitri's chivalrous need to keep her included in conversation. These proved to be the longest and most confusing hours of her life so far. Her father's men weren't this interested in her. Suthies wasn't this interested in her. As they traveled and the sun rose, Aloise had become bound and determined to keep her father talking. His jovial remarks about this and that thing that had happened in the Blade Breaker's absence filled the air without end, leaving Byleth adrift and bewildered. Her father's men were grumbling a bit, annoyed that their guaranteed paycheck in the kingdom was put on hold and wondering what exactly was going on with their boss. It seemed they had been as much in the dark about her father's past as she was. The Knights of Syros occasionally gave her curious looks, but largely remained silent guards at the front and back of their impromptu caravan. However, for the first time that she could remember, this did not mean that Byleth had been left alone with her thoughts and Suthies' voice. You're trained in hand-to-hand as well? Edelgard said, her tone somehow both impressed and skeptical. To juggle 3 disciplines simultaneously is a daunting prospect. Most students at Garreg Mach are limited to 2. I learned sword and the bow first, Byleth clarified, brawling came later, as did the lance, and I cannot say I am very proficient in the latter. It is useful to have multiple ways of approaching a fight, and being able to enter tournaments is a good way to shore up the accounts when the troop is between jobs. And holy magic? Claude asked slyly. That threw me for a loop. It's so rare that anyone outside of mages and priests have any aptitude for it. Is that right? She shrugged. I'm not sure what to say, I've always had a knack for it. He actually pouted in response, clearly not believing that she was being honest with him. He is such a strange lord. Even compared to Dimitri and Edelgard, who were clearly putting effort into making her comfortable, he was casual and coarse and nothing like the usual haughty or cold, cruel, heartless men her father was occasionally contracted by. She kept finding her eyes drawn to him, to his golden skin and mysterious green eyes and friendly disposition, and feel a tug of some nameless foreign feeling. Whenever she fell out of step with him, she would speed up or slow down until they matched again. It was silly, and she couldn't explain it even to herself. Was it just because he was a handsome man? Surely not. Even as she'd grown into her body, she'd felt very little emotional or physical inclination towards intimacy. Such things were associated with a humanity that had always been lost to her. Yet she couldn't deny what she could only describe as a curiosity. Why didn't that warm, welcoming smile, a look so very few people had directed at her, reach his eyes? What melancholy made him reserve himself? Perhaps it was merely meant to ensnare her. That thought should offend or worry me, yet it doesn't. Being troubled was not something she experienced, after all, no more than anything else. All she felt was a tugging need to know, to understand. To repay the strange feeling his bright smile gave her. Which wasn't to say she wasn't curious about the others. Dimitri seemed more relaxed now, his posture less rigid, his gaze less distracted. It definitely brought out his gentler features. He looked every inch a prince, a man who valued that aspect of his being quite deeply. That was not something Byleth saw overmuch. Her job exposed her to many freaks, fools and monsters, but the times she ran into actual knights and heroes, well, the results were often memorable, for good, or for ill. His fascination bewildered her, to be sure, but his earnestness was charming. It was odd to think of him as the prince of the Holy Kingdom within the cold north. She would have thought him aloof, chilly, or even slightly hostile to a mercenary such as herself. After all, those who sold their swords to the highest bidder were not famous for upholding the sacred laws of the church. Edelgard, her fascination was a tangible thing. Byleth wouldn't say she was discomforted, just uncertain what it meant. Appraising eyes had found her a few times before, and it had made her father irritable. To this day, Byleth wasn't certain why. Being able to heal has proven invaluable, she insisted in the face of Claude's disbelief. Particularly when I'm sent to retrieve hostages. She rubbed her left arm, feeling for an old scar that ran up to her wrist. Have you taken many such jobs? Dimitri asked curiously. Some, Byleth nodded, her thumb idly tracing the line beneath her coat. The first time involved slavers, pirates raiding the Northern Alliance border to keep the salt mines running. She blinked and mused. I think that was when people started calling me by that title. Odd, in retrospect. I did not cut a very imposing figure at 13. Wait, I heard about that, Claude said slowly. One of the ships drifted ashore, the mast burning and a lower deck covered in corpses. That was you. Not wholly me, Byleth frowned slightly. I had infiltrated the hold, posing as a slave, to ensure they couldn't massacre the merchandise before we rescued them. Father and the mercenaries dealt with those above deck. They didn't take your weapons? Edelgard inquired. I hid razor blades in my hair. Byleth shrugged. After I killed the first two, I stole a bow off a corpse and used the door to pick off the rest who approached via the hall. It was a very favorable position, most of them died before I ran out of arrows. I had to improvise a bit at that point. Fortunately, the first mate was drunk, and I've always been unusually strong considering my slight frame. You were so young, Dimitri sounded faintly incredulous. Byleth looked quizzically at him. Do you not start weapons training at 5 in the kingdom? I was a bit older than that when I began to learn from my father. Well, yes, but you cannot be made a squire, or be sent to the officers' academy, before you turn 15. It's too dangerous, otherwise. I had never thought of it that way, she said, unsure what to parse from that remark. though I suppose my upbringing was not typical, even for a common-born mercenary. Father was always on the move, and as a consequence so was I. I've lived in so many places they've become a blur. I've wandered the shores of Almira and the forests of Brigid. She looked up at the sky. And Father always worked so hard for my sake. One day, I decided I wanted to help. So I learned how to wield blades and arrows, applied myself with the whole of my concentration. She dragged a foot lightly in the dirt, shifting gravel as they walked. Now I fight alongside Father. It never felt unnatural. It just was what it was. So you've never wanted to do anything else? Claude asked lightly. Never wanted a break. Byleth tilted her head. I'm not sure what you mean. We have lives outside of contracts and battle. My father likes to fish, Hannah cares for horses, Gustav tends to plants and feeds birds whenever possible. I've done all those things, it's pleasant. Hey kids. Aloise's voice caught their attention. The man was looking over his shoulder at them, waving at the trees ahead. We're almost there. Lunch and other amenities await. A cheer went up from the mercenaries. Geralt even let out a good-natured chuckle. Byleth was keenly aware of the fact she'd only eaten a bowlful of grapes since they set out that morning, and she accepted those words with a great sense of relief. This will be your first time at the monastery, right? Dmitri asked. I'd love to show you around, if you'd like. It really is Fodlan in a nutshell, Claude mused, the good and the bad. Like it or not, we'll be there soon, Edelgard said mildly. Any comment Byleth might have decided to make was swept away when they stepped free of the trees and her eyes fell upon one of the most amazing sights in the known world. Sitting upon vast, sweeping fields of grass and greenery was a sprawling and elegant castle whose many towers scraped the sky itself. Byleth was not a very verbose woman, and in that moment she was speechless with awe, stopped mid-step to gaze up at the glorious building. Suthies was right. This was significant, somehow. This place. +_+++++. Things moved fairly smoothly after that. After a warm meal in the dining hall, the lords split off from them, and Byleth found herself missing their presence as she rejoined her father and waited in a large, beautifully decorated cathedral within the second floor of the massive complex. Geralt was worried. The stiff way he held himself and his rigid back were all but screaming his unease to the heavens. It's been years since I last set eyes on this place, he admitted. To see her again. Her. She repeated softly. Geralt glanced at her. Didn't you see her in the courtyard? The lady looking down on us from the balcony? That's the Archbishop. Lady Rhea. Now that he mentioned it. I think so. She frowned at him. Who is she? You know the majority of Fodlan follow the teachings of Saint Cyros, who brought word from the goddess in our darkest days. Geralt said by the way of explanation. A small frown crossed his face. The leader of that ridiculously large organization is the Archbishop. Are you afraid of her? That thought made Byleth about as uneasy as she came. Her father was a fearless man. He was more powerful than anyone she'd ever met in their many travels, fighting the likes of Nader the undefeated and coming out victorious. He only ever worried about her and her unnatural stoicism. For him to be afraid, what sort of woman were they dealing with? Geralt didn't get a chance to answer. The door swung open and admitted two people the likes of which Byleth had not seen before. Thank you for your patience, Geralt, the man said, his voice sharp and to the point. He had dark green hair and stern green eyes several shades lighter than Claude's more natural-seeming orbs. He wore dark blue silk with gold embroidery that likely cost the same as their entire monthly budget. A handsome man, if a strange and very taciturn-looking one. My name is Seath. I am an advisor to the Archbishop. Right, her father murmured. Apparently, he didn't recognize the man. Hello. It has been a long time, Geralt. The woman said softly. Byleth's eyes riveted to her. They were the same height, yet the woman had more poise, more softness. Her long green hair offset the significant ornamentation she wore, a gold circlet, a large silk head-dress, lilies. She wore primarily white and other soft colors. She looked motherly, though what gave the young mercenary that impression, she could not say. I wonder, was it the will of the goddess that we have another chance to meet like this? Byleth did not remember the mother who died giving birth to her. Her father had no pictures, and it pained him to speak of those days. Perhaps that was compelled her to pad forward a few steps, remove herself from her usual haunt in her father's shadow so she might be seen. "Forgive my silence all these years," Gerald said, bowing deeply. "Much has happened since we last spoke." "So I see," Lady Rhea said lightly, her gaze moving to Byleth. "The miracle of fatherhood has blessed you. This is your child, is she not?" "Yes. Born many years after I left this place. I wish I could introduce you to her mother, but we lost her to illness." Byleth blinked once, twice, and resisted the urge to give her father a strange look. That was different from what he'd told her. "I see. My condolences," the Archbishop said, her voice soft and soothing. Her attention didn't move, however. "As for you, I heard of your valiant efforts from Eloise. What is your name?" Byleth swallowed lightly, and wondered if her mother had looked like Rhea. "I am Byleth," she said, bowing her head. "A fine name indeed," Lady Rhea murmured. "From the bottom of my heart, I thank you for saving those students of the Officers' Academy." Her father sighed. Byleth discreetly elbowed him, quietly impressed that he needed reminders of politeness after all the grief he'd given Gustav over the years. Rhea must have seen it, though, because her smile grew visibly. "Gerald. You already know what it is I wish to say, don't you? You want me to rejoin the Knights of Syros?" Gerald ran a hand through his hair. "I'm not saying no, but—" "Your apprehension stings," Lady Rhea said gently. "I had expected Eloise had already asked this of you." "He did," Byleth noted. Loudly. "Many times." Gerald ran his hand down his face and gave her a rueful look. She flushed and clasped her wrist with one hand, averting her eyes. "I must step away now," the Archbishop said. Byleth felt a funny warmth in her chest at the clear amusement dancing in the stately woman's eyes. "But I expect they will desire a word with you soon. Please listen carefully to what they have to say. Until tomorrow, farewell." Giving Byleth one last smile, she and Seath departed. Byleth rocked on her heels, bringing both her hands up to her chest. This day was strange, strange, strange. She hadn't felt so, well, lively for lack of a better word, in a long time. Only some scattered days in her childhood could compare to the number of feelings she'd experienced ever since the morning. "Look at you," Suthies thought in amusement. "Bouncing like a child with sweets. Enjoying all the attention you're getting?" "Mean," she fired back without heat. "It is nice to not be looked at with unease, suspicion, and fear. Don't you understand? You are with me, after all." "Kman, kid," Gerald said before Suthies could retort. She turned to him. He was trying to smile, but it came out as a grimace. "I'll show you the room they've set up for you, and where the bathhouse is. Then you can eat and rest. It's been a long day." "Okay," she said softly, deciding not to prod him right now. He always explained things to her eventually. Chapter 4. You promised me, son, you promised to avenge us. Dmitri woke violently in the middle of the night, the sweat soaking his skin causing him to shiver. A whiff of smoke burned at the back of his throat along with a lingering piercing scream, yet aside from the roaring wind, the upper dormitories were as silent as a crypt. I will, he whispered pleadingly, "I haven't forgotten, I just need more time." He heard his father scoff and squeezed his eyes shut. "I swear, it will be done, I will find them." The words echoed through his Spartan room, with nothing but the wind to answer him. Dmitri drew his legs up to his chest and pressed his forehead against his knee, gulping for air as he tried to remember how to breathe. Tried to forget the weight of Glenn's corpse, pinning him to the ground even as it saved him from the arrows falling from the sky. Tried to forget his father's dying shrieks. Tried to forget the stench of flesh burning throughout the chaos. "Don't ever forget me, Dmitri." "How could I?" Dmitri uttered, raking one hand through his hair. "Glenn, how could you believe I would?" A dryly amused chuckle, a sound Glenn had always reserved for Felix when his little brother dramatically failed to understand something he was driving at, was his only answer. Suddenly his room was suffocatingly small, the walls pressed in and the shadows were malevolent, living things. Dmitri got up and fumbled in the dark, grabbing the long coat he usually reserved for Fergus's cold winters of the wall. It didn't matter that it was late summer, he was cold and couldn't stop trembling. Sliding the familiar fur on over his clothes, he'd trained late into the evening and forgotten to change before collapsing on his bed, all in a vain attempt to avoid these very dreams. He grabbed the door handle and walked out into the dark halls. It was a cool night, with a soft breeze echoing off the stone as he wandered from hall to hall, not really knowing where he was going. Torches snapped and crackled as he passed, one hand trailing along the wall. The physical sensation was comforting, an anchor in the present. He kept walking, his uneven breathing echoing in his ears. At first he thought he would go to the library. Unlike the training grounds, its doors weren't locked after the sun went down, but instead he found himself taking a winding path down to the stables. One of the monastery cats wandered over to him as he stepped out into the open air, winding between his legs. Hesitantly he knelt and petted it, the orange tabby rolled over in contentment. Animals were good companions when you couldn't bear to speak to anyone. Dmitri had learned that in the days after the tragedy, holed up in his room, frequently slipping into delirium with flames blazing every time he closed his eyes. The castle cats had been his saviors then, whenever they didn't surprise him by jumping down from shelves, that is. Dmitri scratched the cat behind the ears, the hard knot in his chest loosening just a bit at the resultant rumbling purr. Good girl. He straightened up and looked up at the sky. It was a brilliant clear night, the silver cross, a thick stream of stars that formed a visible interconnected pattern across all the land, glittering like precious jewels. What was that story Did told me? Dmitri wondered as he gazed upwards. It was something about Duskar's sky god and his last visit to the mortal lands. There was a woman there, one he loved. Was she murdered, or did she willingly walk to her death? Either way, the cross is her blood, raised up and formed into a great and powerful gateway, the final barrier between heaven and earth. How did that tale go? I can't believe I've forgotten. I'll have to ask him to tell me again. There was something in the scriptures of the goddess about the silver cross, but it seemed a more mundane tale, a gift fashioned by Suthies for a particularly devout priestess after the deaths of her entire family. Strings of silver gems, hung from the gates of heaven, so all could look up and see their loved ones in the sky. A simple story, one many found comforting. Perhaps it was unworthy of him as the holy prince that he felt afraid instead. The cat let out a small whine and head-butted his leg. Dmitri gave it a final pet and walked out of the main monastery. Perhaps animals are wiser than we like to believe. Ever since his troubles had emerged, he'd quickly taught himself to hide it, to be stoic or merely frustrated when inside he was screaming. Only Felix has seen under the mask. He lamented that, missed their old friendship, but perhaps it was good that someone knew of that dark, swirling undercurrent. It meant there was someone who could stop him if he lost himself. He shuddered. Why was it so cold? It was still summer. He pulled his coat tighter and focused on walking. The stone ground turned into sand and gravel as he walked into the stables. That was when he noticed the person singing. For a moment, he thought it was another lingering memory. His stepmother had loved to sing, and her lullabies frequently haunted him in the nights when sleep was evasive or disturbed. But, no. He didn't know this voice very well. This was. He turned, casting his eyes around in the dim light, looking for the source. They weren't here, but they were close by. Hesitantly, he turned and tried to follow it. After a few false starts, he found himself walking down the overcast path past the knight's hall. The words grew clearer and more distinct as he went, a beautiful and achingly melancholic tune he'd never heard before. He turned the corner near the church cemetery and his breath caught in his throat. Byleth, Professor Byleth, he reminded himself quickly, even if she wasn't teaching homeroom for him and his, she would still lead seminars in auxiliary combat and it wouldn't do to address her otherwise, was standing at the stone railing with her back to him, singing to the night sky. She wore a long black dress that hung down to her ankles, sleeveless and backless that hung loosely off her body. She was barefoot and seemingly untroubled by the wind and stones in the ground. She sang softly, gently, with a little hesitation here and there suggesting she wasn't certain she remembered the notes correctly. She's beautiful. I had noticed before, but, he thought dazedly, before quickly chasing that errant teenage thought down and throttling it. What is she doing up so late? Quietly he made his way over to her, carefully, not wanting to interrupt the song. He'd never heard it before, pure and simple notes of joy mixed with grief and longing. What were the words meant to go with it? The song tapered off suddenly. Byleth twisted and looked over her shoulder, tense. "Who's there?" "I'm sorry," he responded, abashed, as he stepped into the torchlight. She shifted in what he thought might be surprise, before visibly relaxing. "I didn't mean to intrude." "Prince Dimitri." She frowned slightly. "What are you doing awake so late?" "So early, to be truthful. The sun will be up in a scant few hours." Some old thoughts were troubling me. When I couldn't get back to sleep, I decided to try and walk it off. His eyes lingered on her bare shoulders for a few seconds too long before he could pull his attention away, face burning. "I wasn't expecting to see anyone." Byleth titled her head and gazed curiously at him for a moment. "I felt confused too," she admitted, her tone soft and even as ever. "I keep waking, as if my mind can't decide which world is the dream." She looked up at the sky, tugging unconsciously at the neckline of her dress. "It's strange. I'm so rarely sleepless, even on the worst days." "Truly?" Byleth blinked. "Well, yes." She let out a huffed breath. "It must be this place. It's strange." "Are you not cold?" he asked nervously. She'd heard him walking up behind her, surely she'd noticed his wandering gaze. Ingrid was very aware of the way people looked at her. Glenn had always been openly appreciative of his fiancée, mind you, so perhaps she'd simply learned to recognize that look in people's eyes. "Oh no. I think it's rather pleasant, actually." Her expression didn't change one iota. Did she just want to watch him squirm? Perhaps that was fair enough. "I didn't mean to wander this far from my room. I had a strange thought in my head, but once I got here, I lost it." She frowned, looking down the stairwell toward the cemetery, the stone monuments casting long shadows over the grass. "I suppose it must not have been important." He wasn't sure what to say to that. "I'd never heard that song before." "Do you know what it's called?" She bit her lip lightly. "I don't, actually. I'm not sure where I heard it, or what the words are. It's an old memory of mine, someone sang it to me. I don't know who, or when it happened, or if it's even real, but I find it comforting." "It's very soothing," he said softly. She looked at him again, very intently, and asked, "I can sing it again, if it would help you." "You look haggard, Your Highness." Dimitri's breath hitched. "That's very kind of you," he said softly. "And, you don't have to call me by my title in this place. Here, I'm nothing but another student." Byleth blinked twice, and he thought he saw the faintest trace of a surprised smile if only for a moment. "All right," she said, a note of warmth in her voice. Then she took a few deep breaths, and began to sing again. Dimitri closed his eyes, placing one hand on the ledge and leaning his weight on it as the sweet, sad tune filled his entire world. He missed his stepmother, more so than usual in that moment. He remembered how he crawled to her as a child, shivering from nightmares, and she would hold him in his arms and hum until he fell asleep. He didn't remember his birth mother. Whenever he tried to picture the woman, he saw Patricia instead. She would laugh if she could see him now, flustered by his barely older professor. Her gently amused smile while watching him give the dagger to Edelgard stuck with him, after all. Byleth had a pretty voice. Annette would be delighted if she could hear her sing. "I don't know what's troubling you," the professor murmured after she wound the song to a close, "but I hope you can put it to rest someday. It's casting a shadow over your face." "Is it that obvious?" he whispered without opening his eyes. His shoulders had slumped, the tension gone out of them, and it no longer pained him to breathe. He wondered if Ser Geralt would recognize the music if asked. "Not obvious." "Not quite. But I've seen a lot of people with haunted eyes." He hears her move slightly. "After all, I am the Ashen Demon. Sometimes I'm the cause of it." She sounded sad. "We should go back and try to sleep. The mock battle will need all our concentration, after all." Dimitri wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come to him. "Perhaps I'm more than you," he said with a rueful chuckle. Claude looked as pleased as a particularly content cat at dinner yesterday, and I have no doubts as to why. She let out a startled giggle. He is strange, she said in a rush. He's a mysterious man, and I think that I should be a bit wary of him, but I'm not. Not at all. I chose his house almost in spite of myself. I don't understand it at all. Claude von Regen is a charismatic nuisance, and if you told me he charmed the goddess herself into transforming the Valley of Torment into rich farmland, I would believe you. Dmitri said dryly, opening his eyes to see her vexed expression. He could only smile sympathetically in response. But he is a good man, if a lonely one. You don't have anything to fear from him. She blinked. Lonely? That is not a word I would have used. Ah, I shouldn't have said that. Dmitri groaned sheepishly and ran a hand through his hair. Unbidden, Claude's teasing words suggesting he do something with those unruly locks echoed in his mind, and he suddenly flushed a bit. A nuisance indeed. If and when you start to understand him better, it'll make sense. I see. I suppose, I thought it was because I disturb people, I always have. That old fear, the reason he couldn't quite smile honestly at me. That is not my story to tell, Dmitri said with a sigh, a tinge of pity and sadness sweeping through him as he remembered that hateful soldier and his ugly words. But I doubt it had much to do with you yourself. He's fascinated by you. That much I can tell. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, that vexed look deepening. I don't understand it, but I can tell. Why does that confuse you so? Because people other than my father do not look at me like that. She looked away. I am not completely oblivious, despite my disposition. I've heard frightened people compare me to a gargoyle ever since I was a child. I don't react to pain or fear the way most humans do. That coldness lingers around me like a veil I don't know how to remove. Sometimes I wonder if there's anything under it to reveal by doing so. She shook her head in disbelief. Then here comes this boy, this duke, and he drags me all over the monastery, showing me things, teasing me over that stoicism, laughing and joking like there is nothing strange about me at all. So yes, I am most vexed, Dmitri. I can't really help it. There was a small spark of guilt in his chest. He'd had those very thoughts, watching her carve through bandits without a single change of expression, as though killing meant nothing to her. Well, if it makes you feel any better, he has that effect on many people. She gave him a look that contained that tiny almost smile again. Heh, maybe it does. Dmitri chuckled a bit, enjoying their mutual bewilderment over the brunette, and then offered her his hand. Shall I bring you back to your dorm, Professor? It's quite dark, it may be good to have another set of eyes about. Byleth blinked twice at him before accepting the gesture. Her fingers were slender and strangely delicate, her skin calloused from many years of wielding weapons. It amazed him that she wasn't a little chilly despite being so lightly dressed. Thank you. They didn't say much as they retraced her steps back to the lower dormitories. Byleth took to humming again while Dmitri listened. She knew a lot of music, it seemed, though they all sounded mysterious to his ears. Likely she'd heard them outside of Fodlan. She had made mention of Geralt's mercenaries traveling outside the borders before. Dmitri had never traveled so far, though he wished to, despite all that was tied up with Duskar. The night air swirled around them as they crossed the courtyard, the grass soft underfoot. Byleth stopped at the foot of the stairwell to the dormitory, gently pulling her hand free. She turned back toward him, her eyes a bit brighter than he recalled yesterday, and said, I hope your rest is peaceful, Dmitri. He smiled weakly and bowed, as he always did when people said such things. He appreciated the sentiment but suspected it was in vain. +_++++++. When the sun bled golden light into his room some indeterminate amount of time later, Dmitri only felt partly like a corpse. Which was better than some other nights when he'd been rendered unable to sleep, but not exactly ideal with the mock battle looming mere hours ahead. Staggering out of bed and into a bath, he splashed hot water in his face repeatedly as he began to consider potential strategies. He had some practical experience, but none of his fellow lions did, and Byleth was an intimidating opponent. Even with Hanuman's support, Dmitri did not like his chances against her. The best he could think of was distracting her from Didu, who could potentially overwhelm her through sheer physical strength. However, Byleth had vaguely referenced being stronger than one would expect from her frame, so he was uncertain that would pan out as he hoped. And, of course, he had to consider Claude. Dmitri knew little enough about Almira, but their love of war and strength was a well-told story. It was entirely possible that his fellow house leader knew his way around a fight as much as he himself did, perhaps more so, seeing as Claude managed to kill the man pinning him during the ambush and save him from being choked to death. Fortunately, the other teen preferred the bow, so as long as Dmitri could get close enough, he was confident he could take him out. Admittedly, that didn't account for the other deer who would be joining them, and he didn't know any of them particularly well. Marianne and Lysithea were magically adept, with the former likely specializing in the magic of faith. Raphael was very physically strong and bulky. Ignatz was likely an archer given his constitution. Lawrence and Leonie he had seen handle lances from time to time, and Hilda, he'd never seen her in the barracks, so he wasn't sure what she did. If she didn't weasel her way out of the battle completely. Not all the students in-house participated in the mock battle, since it was merely a warm-up for the Battle of the Eagle and Lion, so he could only make an educated guess who Claude would bring with him. Likely he'd choose at least one mage and someone strong enough to shrug off weaker attacks. He can cover distance attacks himself, unlike me. So, Raphael, Lawrence, or Leonie, and either Marianne or Lysithea. Edelgard will bring Hubert, no question about that. Other than him, I'd be surprised if she chose Ferdinand given how much she obviously dislikes him, but he is capable with a lance. I've hardly ever seen Bernadetta out of her room, so I doubt she'll come, and Dorothea is another obvious choice for a ranged attacker. Petra is also a possibility for a front-line attacker, though she's lighter and comparatively frilier than Ferdinand. So, expect Hubert, Dorothea, and either Ferdinand or Petra. The warm water was a blessing. He didn't know what witchcraft had gone into the water system of the monastery, but he would pay good money for the secret. I should bring Mercedes, Dmitri thought after a moment of contemplation. She knows basic healing and she'd likely have more of an effect on Raphael than any blunt hit. He tapped the edge of the tub. Didu, I need for the professor and possibly Edelgard as well. Ash can provide long-range cover, even if he isn't very strong quite yet, he doesn't need to be. Between them, myself, and Haneman, we are prepared. Felix will be cross at being left out, but he simply isn't good at defending himself. The professor would outmaneuver him and drop him on his back without too much effort. Ingrid is still building up her physical strength, and Annette may be slightly more adept than Mercedes, but she hasn't trained in faith. Healing is very important on the battlefield, especially since we're restricted to a single vulnerary each. Brushing his wet hair away from his eyes, the prince let out a long breath and crawled out. Ah, my head still aches. Well, it's not as bad as it could have been. He was largely rejuvenated, as a matter of fact. That made this one of his better days. He got dressed in his usual dark leathers with some care until he found himself staring at his reflection in the mirror. As usual, his hair was a rumpled mess. Only you can spend an hour in the bath and still look disheveled, Glenn's old joke haunted him. You'd get a lot more attention yourself, another voice said in a low purr. On a whim, surely that's all it was, he took the hairpins Annette had given him a little while back and pulled his blonde locks away from his eyes, pinning them back behind his head. The low ponytail emphasized his angular face, and would keep his vision clear during battle. Giving himself a bemused smile, he turned and left the room, heading for the officers' academy. It was a brilliant clear day, the sun shone like a golden shield in the clear sky, there was a mild breeze and it was warm without being sweltering. He made his way across the fields, vaguely hoping that some tea before the battle would drive his familiar feeling headache away. Sleep deprivation was an old friend, and even if he was numb to the small aches and pains it gave him, that didn't mean they weren't distracting. Dmitri pushed the double doors to the Blue Lion's classroom open and was pleasantly surprised to find all his fellow students milling about, waiting for him. He had been certain he would have to chase down Sylvain at least. Annette and Mercedes were sitting together hunched over a book, having an animated discussion. Ingrid was trying to tell Felix something he clearly wasn't very interested in while Sylvain tried to flirt with her. Ash was studying, and Dida was standing off to the side, likely having been debating whether or not to go get him. "Good morning, everyone," he said. "Oh, Dmitri. There you are, Annette said cheerfully, looking up. Then her eyes widened. Why you look different? I mean, it's nice, I just, when did that happen? This morning, Dmitri replied, slightly bewildered. Mercedes giggled lightly. Is that so? It's a good look on you. Who recommended it? Ah, I couldn't say. The prince had no idea what to make of the way Annette and Ingrid were both gaping at him, or Sylvain's curious expression, for that matter. Clearing his throat awkwardly, he went on, the mock battle takes place after lunch, let's discuss strategy a bit, shall we? Kman, you're not getting off the hook that easily. Sylvain responded with a very irritating and worrying smile, making his way over from the shelves. You've never done anything about your hair before, no matter how many times I nagged you. Do you have a date? Looking to impress someone? No, of course not. Dmitri said while gave the skirt chaser an intensely exasperated look. It's hardly important right now. I've largely decided on our team for the battle, but I want to know what the rest of you are expecting. The new professor is the biggest threat, Felix pronounced evenly. She has to be taken out for victory to be possible. Is she really that strong? Ingrid wondered. I met her yesterday when Claude was dragging her all over the monastery. I know you said she's skilled, Your Highness, but she just seemed kind of awkward and strange to me. What do you mean? Ash said in surprise. I spoke to her, and she very polite. A bit quiet, but kind. It's hard to believe people call her by that creepy name. I assure you, Ingrid, she's exactly as dangerous as Felix believes, Dmitri responded wryly. However, we cannot completely discount Claude and his fellow students. With that in mind. Sure enough, Felix scowled when he announced his choice of fighters for the battle, arguing vehemently for a few minutes before finally giving up. Mercedes suggested, somewhat to his surprise, that Claude would in fact bring Hilda with him, despite her layabout tendencies, because she was quite good with an axe. Didier believed that Marianne and Dorothea would both make appearances. He also agreed to help Dmitri attempt to subdue Byleth. Sylvain expressed the opinion that Edelgard would sooner wait for them to exhaust themselves fighting the deer before moving in to clean up, while Annette argued that the future Empress would charge first because she disliked leaving things to chance. Ash nervously offered to take out Hubert and Marianne/Lysithea, given his decent ability to resist magic. Suggestions flew thick in the air on who would go on the offensive first, how they should adjust depending on the circumstances, what the terrain would be like. Dmitri quickly found himself thinking that he was lucky to be surrounded by intelligent people willing to argue with him. Should I bring a bow, Dmitri? Mercedes asked sweetly. I'm not very good with it yet, but it will give me another option to attack. It couldn't hurt, Dmitri agreed. Using too much magic in a short space of time was known to stress even experienced mages out, after all. Poor Ash looked so anxious when he was definitively told that he'd be close to the action. Didu asked extensive questions about how Byleth fought and what his liege would recommend. It wasn't much, and Mercedes looked fairly intimidated when Dmitri talked about how the professor cut down 2 bandits one after another without breaking stride. It'll be a good fight, Boar, Felix snorted, that slightly resentful look remaining. If you can take her. Dmitri made himself smile in return. I'm sure you'll find her lingering in the training grounds before long, Felix. The year has only just begun after all. He clapped his hands together. We've prepared as much as possible, I think. Come, let us go to the dining hall and eat before we depart for the field. His classmates nodded collectively and followed him out of the room. +_+++++. The field chosen for the battle wasn't far from the monastery. It was a forested area, gently rolling hills dotted with trees and bushes. Dmitri took a deep breath, his brain buzzing with anticipation. There was no real high ground, only a few ruins one person could use as decent cover. No advantages, unless one was good at exploiting terrain. I had only ever fought with a city before, discounting that bandit ambush. Atop the hill north of the field, the highest vantage point available, stood Seath and Ser Geralt, there to oversee the match. The Archbishop herself was absent, apparently, something important was demanding her attention. Dmitri shifted his grip on the lance he'd been given and grimaced at its lightness. They'd all been given blunted training versions of their favored weapons to avoid serious injuries. Live steel wasn't used outside of the Battle of Eagle and Lion. A good idea, yes, but the difference between this and his usual lance was just noticeable enough to be off-putting. Edelgard and the Black Eagles were to his far left, with Ferdinand and Hubert out front while Dorothea lingered amidst the trees with her house leader. Manuela stood a bit further back, perched atop what might have been the base of a monument long ago. It was hard to tell about what he expected, though with the branches and bushes in the way it would be hard to approach his stepsister on anything but her terms. That was how she'd always preferred it. The golden deer, meanwhile, were out in the open, due south of his position. Claude looked to be conferring with Byleth, gesturing up the plain. The professor was too far away to read what minute expression she had, but he got the impression she was disputing whatever the archer was saying. With them were Hilda, Raphael, and Marianne, the latter of whom was fidgeting quite visibly. It reminded Dmitri a bit of Bernadetta. Perhaps Claude would have been better served to bring Lysithea. It looked like Byleth was restricted to one weapon, or perhaps had chosen to go without her bow for one reason or another. That was a bit of a relief, actually. Now, if he could only lure her toward Didu, he'd need to catch her off guard, and he'd need the other deer to be preoccupied. Perhaps he should wait it out while Edelgard fought them? He disliked the thought. It was dishonorable. Byleth pointed at something. He wasn't sure, given the angle through which he could see her. Interestingly, though, Claude jolted back a few steps. He waved his hands slightly. Byleth nodded, the gesture brisk and sharp. The archer looked up at the plain, chuckled, and bowed his head in submission. Both Raphael and Hilda twisted to stare at their leader, who clapped and repeated whatever the professor had said to him. "Oh dear," Mercedes murmured. "What are they saying, Dmitri?" "They're too far away to tell," he replied apologetically. "Be prepared for anything." "Of course, Your Highness," Didu said stoically. Ash made a noise of agreement that couldn't quite hide his trepidation. Then the starting horn blared. Dimitri's pulse jumped. "Ash, I need you on the front lines. Stay close to the woods. Didu, Mercedes, get ready." He hit his lance against the ground and readied it. A surge of excitement washed over him. "Professor, Claude, Edelgard, show me what you can do. Makes this a challenge." The golden deer scattered in both directions. Ferdinand was charging Raphael, Hubert lingering just behind him. Dimitri's brow furrowed. He'd thought Edelgard would play more defensively, that's why she's chosen the trees, but Ferdinand was quite bent on showing her up, wasn't he? He was loud-mouthed enough about it the few times they'd crossed paths. She should have brought Petra in his place. There was a flare of bright light, Nosferatu, unless he missed his guess, and Ferdinand staggered backward. Raphael then slugged him into the chest, once, twice, and then finished him off with a kick that sent him sprawling onto his back in the grass. That was a mistake. He left himself open to Hubert. Wait. The flicker of an arrow whisking through the air struck the dark mage. Dmitri strained, trying to see Claude. He must have retreated into the forest, then watched as a black-clad figure hurtled across the ground and slammed the flat of her training sword into his stomach. Was that Wrath Strike? There were certain techniques one could use if you had even the slightest affinity for magic. He knew at least one himself, and it wasn't a surprise to see her use it. Hubert staggered backwards, clutching his stomach. There was a flash of pink hair before Hilda put him in an armbar and forced him to his knees. Hubert struggled for a moment before Seath shouted for the students to know when they were beaten, then he slumped, clearly furious with himself for being tricked by Raphael's apparent vulnerability. To use one of their own as a feint, in a pitched battle, that would put him in severe danger. Especially if he has low resistance, given how Marianne is fussing over the burn Hubert gave him. "Claude, what are you thinking?" Marianne shrieked in surprised pain as Ash's arrow struck home. Raphael jolted and immediately threw himself in front of her, cradling her so anything that followed up would have to strike through him to reach her. Byleth whirled on the spot and hurtled toward the Ash's position without a moment's pause. "Your Highness, wait," Didu's warning made him realize his feet had carried him forward instinctively. "Claude will snipe you before you reach him." Ash's pained yelp made him flinch. I sent him too far ahead, he groaned. An easy mistake to make, men rumbled from somewhere behind him. Usually in this battle the students spread out in an attempt to take out as many opponents as possible. It was frugal of them to stick closer to each other, clearly. Claude's distinctive golden form appeared from the trees. Ash stumbled out a moment later. It was too distant to tell, but it looked like the boy gave him an apologetic grimace before leaving the field. Dimitri silently promised to make it up to the young man later on. Byleth stepped out into the light and began walking directly up the pathway between where Edelgard was holed up and the place the Blue Lions were waiting for them. Her students promptly fell in a loose circle around her, holding their weapons out in an open challenge. Is she serious? Some small part of his brain told him that it was too easy, that any of the dozens of thoughts that crossed his mind in that moment would already have been raised by Claude. His schemes were more than just absurd pranks. He'd proven that in the ambush, that he should wait and maintain his position. Of course, with Edelgard appearing from the side along with Dorothea, well, with half the team occupied, this was as good a chance as any to try and remove the professor from the field. He nodded sharply at Didu and surged forward. The fight was not an easy one to enter. Claude shot Dorothea with 2 arrows in the stomach, taking the heat off of Raphael, who needed to clear a few feet of distance before he could seize the slender mage. Hilda covered her house leader from Edelgard, who brought her axe down in a powerful arc that made the pink-haired girl's arms buckle when she blocked it, barely stopping a nasty blow to the shoulder. Marianne took that chance to fire another Nosferatu at his stepsister while she was caught in blade lock. Elle flinched, but held her ground rather better than Ferdinand. She was aware of Byleth approaching her, quick as the wind, but she couldn't quite prepare, not when Hilda broke the impulse and took a swipe at her. Byleth darted around her and struck the future empress harshly from behind with the hilt of her sword, avoiding her spine, of course, but the blow was anything but pleasant given Edelgard's pained shout. She followed it up with a kick, sending Elle sprawling to the ground. His stepsister rolled over with some effort, throwing her spare weapon, an axe, at Hilda. That struck home, causing the pinkette to stagger. Despite that distraction, Byleth either saw him coming out of the corner of her eye or heard some tell, because she turned around just as he closed in on her. Mercedes and Didu were right behind him. Mercedes took a potshot at Marianne that clearly hit on a bruise Ash had left her earlier, because she collapsed back against a tree trunk. Claude swore and rushed to cover her, and with Hilda distracted by a flagging but ever-determined Edelgard. He swung his lance up, just missing her shoulder. She jerked aside and stumbled when she hit Didu's back. The tall man immediately trapped her arms at her side in his stone grip. Byleth gasped out something distinctly unfriendly sounding in what was either an Almiran or Dagia dialect, and jerked her head back. The impact against Didu's face was painful looking. The unfortunate fact of the matter was the professor's unusual height made her one of the few who could say they could do so. He held firm, though. Unfortunately, just as he raised his lance to try and take the young mercenary out, something hard and painful hit his back. Dimitri staggered and looked over his shoulder and found Claude several feet away, already lining up another arrow. He swore the brunette smirked triumphantly before letting loose. Dull-headed arrows weren't nearly as painful as the real thing, but getting hit in the stomach, no matter what with, was often entirely debilitating. He heard Marianne shout, followed by Didu grunting in pain. Coming to the realization that he was surrounded, Dimitri shifted his grip on the lance and threw it directly at his opponent. The split second of Claude's eyes widening in surprise before the impact, which knocked him back into a tree, was well worth it. Something hit his shin, unbalancing him so the follow-up attack sent him crashing to the ground. A moment later, a knee pressed against his chest and Dimitri blinked blearily up at the bruised and faintly impressed face of Byleth Eisner. She was panting slightly as she placed the blunt blade of the training sword across his neck, uttering, "Not bad. But not enough." When had she? Ah, Marianne. Dimitri looked slightly to the right and saw the blue-haired girl frantically apologizing to a prone Didu as Raphael helped the Dusker native back to his feet. Mercedes was leaning heavily against a rock, a bruise visible at her collar. Elle and Dorothea were both gone, clearly having already lost. Letting out a shaky breath, he was fairly certain he was winded. Dimitri opened his hands in surrender. Byleth nodded and stood up, thankfully removing her weight from his aching body. "Claude, how are you holding up?" Ha ha, ow, the brunette laughed before coughing painfully. I'm good, really. Just, need a minute. Marianne, do your best for him. Raphael, with me. Hilda, Claude, keep an eye out for Manuela, she's on the move. With that, Byleth walked out of the area, rubbing her side with a thoughtful sort of discomfort. Raphael hurried after her in awkward gait. See something you like? Glenn's voice asked mirthfully. Dmitri closed his eyes and carefully sat up, his stomach still roiling. Perhaps you ought to learn a bit from Claude, if you're going to charge every trap you come across. Regan's plan was harebrained, his father mused. Engaging both opponents shouldn't have worked, yet he defeated two forces with half the numbers. He made best use of his fellow students' capabilities. Remember this well, Dmitri, for the days when you face overwhelming opposition. I will, he assured them, catching his breath. It was odd, he should be disappointed, he was, to an extent, but he felt oddly excited as well. At the Battle of Eagle and Lion, I'll be ready for them both. Now that would be something to see, Glenn purred. Just don't forget why you're here, my prince. Never, Dmitri promised silently. I will find your killers, I'll find them if I have to tear Fodlan apart. Good, his father replied, the tone of his voice calm, soothing, and pleased. Good. Chapter 5. The final push into Duscur is to be led by Rufus, the late king's brother. He has been convinced to take up stewardship of the kingdom in his nephew's stead by the court, who was previously disqualified from the line of succession for not having a crest. Claude mused. There's no other reason the eldest son wouldn't inherit the throne barring an untimely death or committing murder. Isn't that interesting? He folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the drawer. It was good for him that Seath kept his office so orderly, it meant chasing specific older documents wasn't much of a challenge. Nah, the challenge had been getting that stuffy bishop tipsy enough to swipe his keys. How paranoid did you have to be for your desk to have individual locks on every single drawer? It feels too easy, though, he frowned, thumbing through the church militia's reports throughout the aftermath of the massacre. If there are any rumors about Rufus attacking or otherwise trying to undermine his brother, they're well hidden. Of course, he's a bit more important than Miquelon Gautier. If there were murder attempts, the kingdom wouldn't want them to become public. His fingers brushed against records of the Fairgus emergency meetings that the church mediated. He quickly took it and pulled one out. My grandfather said that King Lambert was attempting a major political reform. Reading all of this, even that feels like an understatement. Open trade? Bringing Duscur warriors and scholars into his court? Talking about sending Dmitri and the Frildarius boys to foreign land to learn the traditional fighting style. I'm amazed only a third of these letters are peppered with disparaging remarks about his heretical worldviews. He rather hoped that no one had said such things to Dmitri's face. A feeble thought, likely, but it was there. It's a wonder anyone believes Duscur is responsible. They're a third the size of the kingdom, and they have bountiful land but little else. They had far too much to gain from King Lambert's offer to do anything but accept. They don't have that old Almiran, warrior's pride, getting in the way. Of course, that means the real question is, who in the kingdom benefits the most from the slaughter of the royal family? Claude squinted at the transcript in the low candlelight. The late hour meant there was no sunlight coming through the window. A description of anarchy in the eastern half of the kingdom, talk of how the knights needed to be reorganized to suppress it, and that was left to the Lord of Arianrod, who'd frequently made no bones of his dislike for Lambert's naivete. Yet he was not one of the three lords who made a lot of loud noise about how Dmitri needed to get married as soon as possible to secure the line of succession, one of whom was aggressive enough that he had his eldest daughter try and slip the prince a knockout drug so she could get pregnant. Claude's lip curled in revulsion. That's disgusting. Seventh hell, he was 14. His father hadn't even been dead for 2 months at that point. Fortunately, Lord Rodrigue was there when Dmitri passed out and interrogated the girl. Having been pressured into it, she broke pretty easily and her father lost his title as a result. Good riddance. So he's not a concern anymore. He could have been involved with Duscur, even tangentially, but I doubt he was smart enough to mastermind it. Not with that mess in mind. Count Rowe of Arianrod is a better bet. He's sitting on top of one of the most fortified cities in Fodlan, next to Fort Mercers. If he got caught, he could try to wait out any retaliation, and he has many friends who want to be able to run there if they got invaded. There's no obvious route to the throne for him, of course, lacking both the crest and any close relation, but if he was involved with the mastermind, he might believe his children have a chance at it. Let's see if your name comes up again. Distant footsteps in the hallway caught his attention. Quickly he shut the drawer and folded himself into the shadow behind one of the room's bookcases, listening intently. Only 3 glasses in and he needed to be helped to Manuela. Sir Gerald's voice echoed through the empty hall. Sheesh. I know some people have a low constitution, but only 3. That's seat for you. Alois laughed. I'll tell you what's amazing, that the Regan boy convinced him to drink anything. He avoids anything improper, partly because of Flane, I'd wager. He dotes on her and doesn't want her to have any bad habits. It must have been years since he drunk anything, if it just took 3 to leave him lurching about. 3 glasses of the strongest wine in the monastery isn't quite the same as the stuff they serve in your average Fodlan bar, Claude thought with a dry smile. I snagged it alongside the good cheese for Teach and the others. The doors weren't even locked tight. He's awfully overprotective, that's for sure, Gerald said with an air of dry observation. Flane herself looks a little stifled, wandering about alone whenever he's busy. She's probably be happier if she had something to do. Perhaps she could join your daughter's class? Or maybe she could work with that young lad the Archbishop brought back from the Goneril estate. He always seems busy, and he might like it. Somehow I don't think Seath would appreciate the suggestion. Their footsteps carried them past the doorway without pause. Claude waited patiently until they faded away completely before returning to the desk, an amused smile on his lips. His candles were melted down to a halfway point. Even if Seath was laid out for the rest of the night, he didn't have all the time in the world. He leaned over the wooden table, turning the pages of the transcript again as he looked for the little hints he'd learned to be wary of ever since joining House Regan. The mediators painted the picture of a disjointed court, nobles arguing with each other over what to do, public order deteriorating, citizens expressing fear for Dmitri, who spent the better part of 5 months hidden away from the public for the sake of his recovery. 5 months, I knew he was the only survivor, but somehow I hadn't thought he'd been injured that badly. Claude went back into the drawer, paging through the folders until he found a relief report that was referenced within the page he had been examining. It turned out that, upon the church arriving to the capital in order to distribute food to the surrounding towns that had suffered from banditry, Dmitri had unexpectedly appeared from his room and asked to travel the circuit with them in what Lord Rodrigue described as more words he'd spoken at once than he had in all the days since his return. The report didn't explain how Dmitri argued his case, but he clearly succeeded because he went with the detachment through every village with a bag of fruit from the castle gardens. The author spoke of how the peasants cried with relief at the sight of him, crowding at his feet as he passed out food, hovering and rushing to prevent him from doing anything strenuous. A couple of bandits had been holding up a storehouse, threatening to set it on fire. Apparently Dmitri went to talk to them, and they surrendered out of shame almost immediately. His people really love him, Claude thought in awe. He felt a twinge of something unpleasant, something that almost tasted like envy. The conspirators are up a creek. Those people would never accept anyone propped up in his place if they got what they wanted. They'd probably slaughter them if they even suspected foul play. That explains why it happened in Dusker. Any incidental death that looked even remotely suspicious would bring riots down on them that would put even this chaos to shame. He flipped through the remaining pages and let out a sigh before returning it to its folder. It looks like the King Regent is the only one with the means and ability to directly seize the throne. He's a known womanizer, sure, he might just like the company, but it's possible he hopes to end up with a kid bearing the royal crest. If that were to happen, well, Rufus was older than Lambert. That child would technically inherit ahead of Dmitri. And wouldn't that be a mess, unless something tragic befell the orphan prince not long after he met his sibling. It was neat, it covered all the bases, and the very record he'd just put away described Rufus and Dmitri arguing heatedly over the latter's decision to go among his people. Claude was willing to bet that a few sly questions would reveal that the two didn't get along in general. It was a perfect setup. It also felt way too easy. Gah. I feel like a character is a play, being misled by some charming rogue while he robs me blind. And I can't even put my finger on what it is that feels so off, it's just a nagging sense that something is wrong. He shut the drawer and locked it, shifting through the keys to find the one for the upper right compartment. At least this isn't a complete bust. The reports in the library are so heavily edited they're barely comparable to these. That makes some sense. If the Alliance or the Empire knew how badly damaged the lands were, they'd likely offer their help in exchange for favors. There's that old popular rant in the Empire about how they never should have let go of their old territories, after all. Though the sheer extent of the alterations, did the Council ask that of you, Lady Rhea, or did you do it? There were a couple of letters in the small drawer, stacked in a neat pile. Taking them out revealed unmarked envelopes and Seath's neat, precise handwriting. These hadn't been shared with other church officials. Brow furrowing in curiosity, Claude opened one. No sign of the force that would have been necessary to get past King Lambert's honor guard, but I did find remains of that magic, near an empty carriage abandoned on the road. Rhea, I wonder if Duskar did this at all. I think those people may have been here, perhaps stirring chaos and confusion, perhaps dripping poison in the ears of the reckless and aggressive. I have no proof, but it's worrying to think about. Those people. Claude repeated aloud before he could stop himself. He snapped a quick look toward the door. It was still silent, with a few people walking around in the distance. Cursing himself for the slip, he looked down and finished reading the letter. Nothing. He looked through the others, which chronicled Seath's short-lived investigation of the Duskar area at least 4 weeks after the battle itself had ended. Nothing elaborated on those people, or the strange magic, or who was supposed to be in the empty carriage, which had the emblem of the Faerghus royal house. Could that have been the Queen's wheelhouse? Did she escape the immediate slaughter only to get caught trying to run for the road? It makes some sense, I guess. All records say that she died there, but the bodies that might have been her were burned beyond identification. They can't be sure exactly where and how she died, aside from the fire. Claude frowned as something odd occurred to him. Was she separated from Dimitri and the others? How did she end up so far away from them? I suppose she probably ran off in a blind panic. Nothing I've heard about Lambert's queen suggested she was a warrior. Those people. Who the hell is that supposed to be? The church, at least the central church, has its detractors, but who among them would orchestrate a slaughter up north for seemingly no purpose? Is it an organization? Is he just referring to some group of nobles with grand, crazy aspirations? Are they heretics? What the hell? Those footsteps are getting louder. Shit. On impulse, Claude grabbed the letters off the desk and tucked them into his coat, blowing the candles out. Dropping the keys on the wooden surface, he hurried over to the window he'd left ajar and climbed out onto the windowsill. The door to the study rattled as he swung his feet over the side and found a foothold in the old worn stone. Glancing over his shoulder, Claude saw one of the many trees surrounding the building creaking in the wind, a couple arms' lengths away. He grimaced, braced himself, and jumped for the lower branches. Pine needles stabbed face, and he nearly lost his balance due to slamming his knee into the trunk hard enough to bruise. Cringing, he grabbed an upper branch and stared warily up at the window. He had good hearing and eyesight, something he could thank his father for. He remained still as a statue, listening to the person, 2 people, stagger about, one of them kicking the bed with a pained curse. Manuela's voice drifted down, murmuring inaudible comfort as she helped the other person, who must be Seath, get settled. Geez, it was just 3 glasses, old man. Marianne can drink that much without getting tipsy, much less wasted. He waited, his attention on the footsteps disappearing until all was still again. That was close, Claude thought ruefully, slowly reorienting himself so he could begin descending to the ground. And I have far more questions than answers. Not to mention absolutely nothing to pass on to Dimitri that he hasn't already at least suspected. There's only those people, whoever they're meant to be. The grass was wonderfully cool under his feet as he dropped down and slipped into the shadows cast by the monastery. If he went around the long way on the outside, he'd be able to scale the wall up to his dorm room. Ah, I bet that's the most that's in Seath's office. He addressed the letter specifically to Rhea. If there's anything else about them on paper, it'll be in her office, and that's a damn sight harder to sneak into. Not to mention potentially dangerous. A half-breed born under foreign sky, taking advantage of the Archbishop's endless kindness? There were less painful ways of killing himself. I'll think of something. I wouldn't be much of a strategist if I couldn't sneak around dangerous people, would I? The tree beneath his window was one of the oldest in the monastery. It towered over the others near it and its highest branches scraped against the high towers. It took him back to the forest he had so loved wandering through as a child. He'd spent so many hours there, wandering, seeking adventure, sometimes hiding from the cruel words of his peers. His mother liked to joke that he had been meant to be a bird upon once again finding him up in a tree, asleep against the trunk. He loved those trees, that familiar place he was always welcome in. He let himself smile at the thought for a brief moment before putting it away. He was not Prince Khalid, not right now. His father's son was traveling, gone on a long pilgrimage to strengthen his will in battle. There was only his mother's son, venturing to her homeland in the faint and vague hope of building bridges. It was one thing for Claude von Regen to be a layabout, a troublemaker, a dangerous trickster. It was another entirely for him to be at all influenced by foreigners and savages. At least, not right now. +_+_+_+_. The first day of class with Byleth, with Teach, was interesting. She'd arrived 10 minutes late, a quick stride in her step and a textbook under one arm, her demeanor brisk and no nonsense. Dropping the book onto the table with an unceremonious thud, she turned on one heel to face them and said, "Good morning, I apologize for my lateness, my preparations ran overtime." She put one hand on her hip and looked out at her new classroom. "Have any of you been informed of what this month's mission involves?" Ignatz hesitantly raised his hand, flinching when her cool stare fell on him. I heard we're being sent out for a practical training exercise. Are we sparring with the knights? There will be an auxiliary battle at the end of this week that this house will be attending, Byleth said with a nod. However, the mission itself will see this class dispatched to the Red Canyon to dispose of the remaining bandits who made the attempt the lives of your fellow students just prior to my arrival. Claude blinked curiously. Huh, they found that guy after he took off? I would have thought he would have kept running until he reached a border, any border. Byleth crossed her arms, her severe expression darkening a bit. Let me make one thing clear, bandits are far from the greatest threat you will face on the battlefield. Bandits are often stupid. They are rarely loyal. Much of the time, they are either peasants who turned to pillaging in the face of crop failure or deserters too violent, insubordinate, or disliked by the local lord to remain in society. However, bandits are desperate people, and that is and will always be dangerous. Her eyes narrowed slightly. When we embark on this mission, you will get injured. There will be real danger. They will not care about your age, your status, your family, anything. They will kill you if they get the chance. None of you are to give them that chance. Am I understood? A moment of stunned silence lay thick in the room. Claude watched Ignatz's expression become stricken, Lawrence sit up as straight as if his father were in the room, Lysathea link her hands under her chin, and Marianne shrink back as though struck. Got it memorized, Teach, he promised, coming to the rescue of his housemates when the moment dragged on. Good, she said briskly. Now, from what I experienced during the mock battle, each of you is competent in at least one kind of weapon. In the 2 weeks before we leave, I want each of you to pick one specialization. She walked to the blackboard and began writing, and begin to make some progress on it. By the time we return, I expect you'll be able to perform well in that role. Practical, real-time experience has no replacement. Especially in war. She dropped the chalk on the desk. On the board there were now several columns, each with the heading Myrmidon, Soldier, Fighter, and Monk. Gareg Mach's famous starting lessons. If you already intend to progress down a certain pathway, please use the board to inform me of your choice. If you're uncertain which way to go about this, come here and speak with me, and I shall do my best to approximate what will work with your strengths. With that, she leaned against the desk and waited. There was an awkward quiet there for a very long moment. Hahnemann and Manuela, who had overseen them before, had always tried to ease their way into this moment with jokes, rambling stories and other socialization tricks. Hearing the situation laid out so immediately, so bluntly, without a single second spent on pleasantries was pretty startling. And the most frustrating thing was her face was a blank goddamn slate. He had to strain to see any tick, any reaction that might indicate her thoughts. In the backstabbing, social climbing high society that was the ruling body of the Lasker Alliance, Claude prided his ability to read his older contemporaries like open books. It had saved his life on a few occasions. It prickled at him, being unable to guess exactly what the mysterious Ashen demon was thinking. The silence was broken by Lysithea standing up, speed walking to the front of the room and writing her name under Monk. Dropping the chalk, she bowed to Byleth and said, "I'm ready to begin." Did Byleth smile a little there? Ah, it was gone so quickly, I'm not sure. Good to hear. That drained the tension away. Marianne hesitantly got up and made her way forward. Leonie shot ahead of her, scribbling her name under soldier before proclaiming, "I'll show Captain Gerald how much I've improved since we last met." Marianne squeaked when the girl walked past her, meekly adding her name to Monk with a mumbled apology before hurrying back to her seat. Raphael and Lawrence came one after another, with Rafe picking Fighter and Lawrence surprising him slightly by picking Monk. Ignatz came the front, paused, and then gave Byleth a helpless look. Her lip twitched upward again as she gestured for him to come closer. Claude made his own way up to the board, watching as his new teacher walked in a circle around the diminutive painter, one hand raised up and resting against her neck as she considered him. He was mildly impressed that Ignatz didn't blush at all under the scrutiny, and perhaps a little bit jealous. "You'll be quick, if you build up your stamina just a bit," Byleth said thoughtfully. "You don't have much in the way of muscle, but with the right weapons and skills, you won't need it." "I won't," Ignatz repeated uncertainly. "There are people who can kill the hardiest of soldiers by exploiting small weaknesses. I've met a few on the job, and they thrive on being quick and hard to hit." She walked around him once more before leaning against her desk again. "I suggest you go with Myrmidon, keep your bow along with the sword. You can adjust along the way if other possibilities present themselves." "Oh, okay. Thank you, Professor." Claude handed him the chalk, having written his own name under Fighter. It was as good a time as any to get better with axes. The bandits had proven that having a close-range weapon to fall back on was a good idea, and wondered if he realized that Byleth was hinting at him making a decent assassin. "Good." Byleth waited until they were back in their seats before speaking again. "This afternoon, we'll be in the training grounds. Until then," she took a small, glittering crystal from her pocket and placed it on the desk. "Is that memory prism, Professor?" Lawrence asked, his tone carefully polite. "Indeed." She nodded slightly. "I want you all to have a good idea of what to expect from battle, and I hope that you will learn a bit from observation. Gerald's mercenaries have taken many missions over the years, and I will be building my lessons around them." She tapped her finger against it. "Shall we begin? Plus underscore plus underscore plus underscore plus underscore. Do you know the story of Ash and his gargoyles, my little prince?" "Of course. He's the god of war. In a time of strife, when the land was overrun by enemies, orphaned children prayed to him for help. He turned stone pillars into winged wolves and filled them with his power. They felt no pain, no fear, and they fought until they were completely destroyed. But they had no souls, so when there were no more enemies to fight, they just stood in place, and all but 3 of the children died from injuries sustained in the battle." Honestly, Claude had thought Teach had been joking about not noticing having stepped on a nail until an hour after her battle with the slavers was over. Seeing the unstoppable Sir Gerald freak out when he saw the bleeding only underscored his daughter's completely apathetic reaction to, again, having a nail driven into her foot. Not a lot surprised him these days, but, damn. The fact that she showed them that part of the memory, rather than stopping directly after she defeated the last of the pirates below deck, spoke volumes. She wasn't embarrassed by her injury or by letting them see her father fuss over her. She didn't make any mock-serious observations about watching your step to downplay what it was like. She didn't even acknowledge it until Hilda asked, at which point she merely observed that she'd felt pain, but had put it aside to focus on fighting. Knowing she was dead serious made the casualness of the words a little terrifying. How badly could Teach get injured before she stopped fighting? Could she take a mortal wound and keep wailing on her enemy regardless until both were dead? Would she stab herself if she needed to get at an enemy behind her? So, why are there gargoyles on the palace, if they failed to save the children? Because they didn't lose the fight. They won, they drove the enemy away and the children that didn't survive died free of captivity. They would never stop fighting for Ash's people. Claude shook his head, watching as Byleth smacked Hilda's shoulder as her momentum carried her to a crashing thud on the floor. The new professor he'd snared, who'd been so endearingly awkward as he introduced her to life at the monastery, complimented the other girl's footwork before critiquing her inability to control her momentum. Despite the fact she hadn't known she'd been made a professor until a few days ago, she slipped into the role as easily as breathing, remaining in the training grounds long after the class day technically ended so her students could test their readiness against her. So deadly, so beautiful. I might be in over my head. He didn't believe that the war god sent his teach. He generally didn't think about such things. Being told that his mother's goddess considered him unclean was enough for one lifetime, thank you very much, but that old story just wouldn't leave him alone. There's no way that's natural. Claude would very much like to try his hand at fighting Teach. Unfortunately, he was best with his bow and had yet to master point blank. It wouldn't be a fun fight if he sniped her from far away, or she simply knocked him over upon getting close enough. Nah, he'd learn the axe first, then he'd challenge her. He rather hoped she'd enjoy that as much as he would. Teach was human. She couldn't possibly be soulless. There were feelings there, somewhere, buried deeply under something he couldn't understand, not yet, anyway. And what kind of prince would he be if he didn't try to help her? He closed his eyes ruefully. He knew what that sounded like, after all. How many lords and kings abused and stomped on the people they needed to achieve their ambitions, only to be totally surprised when those same individuals backstabbed them when shown a kind hand. Why did they get off, treating someone so invaluable to them like dirt? Did it really stress them so hard to be kind? Yes, he hoped that a friendship with Teach would sway her to supporting him in the future. That didn't mean he meant her any ill will. Far from it. He'd much rather bring a smile to that pretty face than see her troubled. You look like you're thinking hard. Are you not going to try your luck? Through long practice, Claude did not fall over in surprise at the unexpected interruption of his thoughts. Turning toward a quietly amused-looking Dmitri, he gallantly replied, "Somehow, I don't think I'd fare any better than you. Not yet, anyway." The prince chuckled. Fair enough. He watched Hilda stumble off the training grounds, only to be immediately replaced with Raphael. Teach's body language shifted into something Claude was tentatively classifying as bemusement as she nodded, idly passing her training sword between her hands. "They're sending you after the bandits. Is that a question or a statement? I had a thought, though I'm loath to mention it. I don't want you going out on a limb looking for trouble." His smile widened slightly until it was a bit coy. "I already have, and for you. There's a couple of things I wouldn't mind doing for you, as a matter of fact. I promise, it's really hard to offend me, Your Highness." "Ask away." Dmitri gave him a look, and yes, there was a capital letter for that particular expression, before saying, "Oh, do stop calling me that. You saved my life, Claude. The very least I can do is insist you use my real name." "I can." "I'm touched, Mitya." "Wow, for only you," the prince sighed in defeat. Then his expression became serious, well, more serious than usual. "It's that man who got away that night. If the possibility presented itself, I'd like to know why he tried to kill us." I can't deny a bit of burning curiosity myself, but it's entirely possible the answer would be immensely unsatisfying. Claude put his hands behind his head. "I've had people in Alliance territory not recognize me before. He might have just seen some rich kids and decided to try his luck." "And if he didn't?" Dmitri asked simply. Claude raised an eyebrow and thought about that for a moment. That would raise a number of questions. Check the description for the links to the author.